There is a machine out there that deploys gas, launches homing missiles, summons entire squads of Ark units to fight on its behalf, and walks around behind a shield that nothing can penetrate. And today we are going to go through everything about the Matriarch, what it is, how it was built, and what it truly represents in the Ark Raiders universe. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I put this video together because the Matriarch is one of those enemies that players encounter and immediately feel like there is more going on beneath the surface than a simple boss fight. The way it moves, the way it commands other units, the way it seems to be protecting something specific, all of that points toward a deeper story. When I was assembling this video, I made the choice to focus on the Matriarch's role as a command structure rather than just a combat encounter, because I think that framing opens up the most interesting questions about what the Ark machines actually are and why they operate the way they do. I excluded a lot of the pure gameplay analysis and kept the focus on the lore and the implications. So let us get into it. Chapter 1. The world that the Ark fell into. The world of Ark Raiders is not a world that collapsed overnight. It is a world that was already in the process of rebuilding itself when the Ark arrived, and that detail matters more than most players probably realize when they first pick up the game. The settlements you move through, the underground bunkers where the raiders operate from, the scattered remnants of pre-Ark infrastructure visible in the ruins above ground, all of these things suggest a civilization that had already been through at least one catastrophic event before the machines came down from the sky. There is a layered quality to the devastation in this world, and understanding that layering is the first step toward understanding what the Matriarch really represents. The surface world of Ark Raiders is hostile in a very specific way. It is not simply dangerous the way a war zone is dangerous, where the threat comes from other human beings with competing interests. The Ark machines operate on a logic that feels fundamentally alien to human decision-making, and yet they are not random. They patrol, they coordinate, they respond to human presence in ways that suggest awareness, if not quite consciousness. The Matriarch in particular behaves in ways that strongly imply something like tactical intelligence, and that implication is worth sitting with for a while before we move on to the specifics of its hardware. One of the things the game does well is resist the temptation to over-explain its world. The lore is fragmented by design, delivered through environmental details, snippets of dialogue, and the behavior of the machines themselves, rather than through explicit exposition. This means that a lot of what we think we know about the Ark and about the Matriarch is actually inference. It is pattern recognition. We see what these machines do, we observe how they interact with each other and with the environment, and we construct a picture of what they might be from those observations. That interpretive process is exactly what makes the lore compelling, and it is what I want to walk you through in this video. The raiders themselves are a crucial part of understanding the world context. These are people who descend from underground settlements, sometimes solo, sometimes in small teams, to scavenge the surface for resources that their communities need to survive. They are not soldiers in any formal sense. They do not have the backing of a unified military or government. They are, in the most literal sense, survivors doing what survivors do, which is finding ways to keep going in conditions that were designed to stop them. The fact that the Ark machines seem specifically calibrated to make that survival as difficult as possible is one of the most interesting tensions in the game's premise. The underground settlements where raiders operate from represent humanity's last real foothold in this world. They are not comfortable places. They are not utopias that contrast cleanly with the hellscape above. They are cramped, resource-starved, politically complicated communities where the people making decisions about who goes to the surface and what they bring back are working with incomplete information and desperate circumstances. The pressure that creates on individual raiders is significant, and it shapes the relationship between the people who live underground and the machines that dominate the surface above them. The Ark machines did not simply appear one day and start attacking. The arrival of the Ark, based on what the game suggests, was an event with a specific shape to it, a descent that came from above, that targeted infrastructure, that seemed to understand what human civilization needed to function, and attacked those things systematically. Power grids, communication systems, transportation networks. These were not random targets. The Ark came down with what looks like a prioritized list of things to destroy, and that prioritization tells us something important about whoever or whatever designed them. The ruins on the surface carry the evidence of that initial assault in ways that are easy to miss if you are focused on the immediate threat of the machines currently patrolling the area. Collapsed transmission towers, destroyed generator stations, roads that were deliberately targeted rather than simply caught in the crossfire of a broader conflict. When you start mapping the destruction against what was being destroyed, a picture emerges of a campaign that was specifically designed to strand human beings, to cut off their ability to coordinate, to communicate, and to resist. That is not the behavior of a machine that is simply attacking what it encounters. That is strategic thinking. The question of where the Ark came from is one that the game deliberately leaves open, and I think that openness is intentional rather than lazy. Several possibilities are implied by the available evidence. The most straightforward reading is that the Ark descended from orbit, possibly from some kind of station or installation that was either built for the purpose of launching them or repurposed at some point. The machines have a quality to them that suggests they were designed for vacuum or near-vacuum operation and were adapted for atmospheric use, which would be consistent with an origin in space or near space. Another reading, one that the environmental law occasionally gestures toward, is that the Ark machines were not built by an external force at all, but are the product of human technology that was modified, corrupted, or repurposed by something else. This reading is more uncomfortable and more interesting because it raises questions about human culpability in what happened to the world. If the Ark machines were originally human-designed, then the civilization that the raiders are trying to preserve might bear some responsibility for the thing that is trying to destroy it. That tension does not resolve cleanly, and I do not think it is supposed to. What we can say with confidence is that by the time the game begins, the Ark have been operating on the surface for long enough to have established something resembling an ecosystem. There are different types of machines with different functions. There are patterns of movement and patrol that suggest coordination. There are locations on the surface that the Ark seem to prioritize protecting, which implies that there are things worth protecting there, assets or infrastructure or processes that the machines are maintaining even as they destroy everything else. The Matriarch is connected to all of this, and that connection is what we are going to spend this video unpacking. The raiders who have survived long enough to develop real expertise about the surface understand that the Ark machines are not simply obstacles. They are, in a very real sense, the primary fact of the world they live in. Everything else, the scavenging routes, the supply chains, the political decisions made in the underground settlements, the training that new raiders go through before their first surface run, all of it is organized around the reality of the Ark and what the Ark will and will not tolerate. Understanding the machines is not an academic exercise for these people. It is a survival skill of the highest order. Among the Ark units that raiders encounter on the surface, there is a clear hierarchy of threat. Some machines are relatively simple, performing specific functions with limited tactical flexibility. Others are more complex, capable of adapting their behavior based on what is happening around them, capable of coordinating with other units, capable of responding to threats in ways that suggest something more sophisticated than basic programming. The Matriarch sits at the top of that hierarchy, not simply because it is large and difficult to destroy, but because it appears to play an organizational role in how other Ark units operate in its vicinity. The lore around Ark unit hierarchy is fragmentary, as most of the lore in Ark Raiders tends to be. But there are enough consistent details across different sources of in-game information to construct a working picture. The basic Ark units, the ones raiders encounter most frequently, seem to operate on relatively simple behavioral protocols. They patrol, they engage, they withdraw to regroup. But around a Matriarch, the behavior of nearby units changes in ways that go beyond simple proximity. They become more coordinated, they fill gaps in coverage more effectively, they respond to threats faster. This suggests that the Matriarch is not just a powerful combatant, but an active command presence that shapes the tactical environment around it. The physical size of the Matriarch is worth discussing in this context, because size alone does not fully explain its role. There are large Ark machines that function as heavy combatants without demonstrating the same command behaviors. The Matriarch's scale matters less than its architecture, and specifically the relationship between its various systems and how they work together to create a particular kind of threat. We will get into the specifics of those systems in later chapters, but the broad point is that the Matriarch was designed, or adapted, to be something more than a weapons platform. It was designed to organize. The world that the Ark fell into was also a world with a history of its own that the game hints at, but does not fully explain. There are references in the environmental law to events that happened before the Ark arrived, to decisions that were made, to technologies that were developed, that may have contributed to the conditions that allowed the Ark to establish themselves as effectively as they did. This is one of the more speculative areas of Ark Raiders lore, and I want to be clear that what I am about to say is one possible reading of the evidence, rather than confirmed canon. There is a possibility suggested by some of the more obscure in-game lore fragments that the Ark machines were not simply an external invasion, but a response to something specific that humanity had done. Not a natural disaster, and not a random attack, but something closer to a programmed consequence. This reading would explain why the initial assault was so precisely targeted, why specific pieces of infrastructure were destroyed while others were left intact, and why the Ark seemed to maintain certain locations on the surface as protected zones rather than simply destroying everything. If the Ark are executing a program with a specific goal, then understanding that goal is key to understanding every individual Ark unit, including the Matriarch. This is the framework I want you to keep in mind as we move through the rest of this video. The Matriarch is not just a big machine with powerful weapons. It is a component in a system that is doing something specific. The weapons, the shield, the gas mines, the ability to summon other units, all of those capabilities exist in service of a function that the Matriarch is performing. Our job is to figure out what that function is, and to do that we need to understand the world it is operating in and the logic that governs its behavior. The scavengers who have had the most direct experience with the Matriarch, the ones who survived encounters with it and came back to tell what they saw, consistently report something beyond simple fear. There is a quality to the Matriarch's presence that experienced raiders describe as deliberate, not aggressive in the way that a simple predator is aggressive, but purposeful, like it is going somewhere, or protecting something, or waiting for something. That quality of deliberateness is what separates the Matriarch from less sophisticated Ark units, and it is one of the things that makes it so difficult to plan for. The underground communities where raiders live have developed their own folk taxonomy of Ark machines based on generations of hard experience. Different settlements use different terms, and the classification systems do not always agree with each other, but certain categories appear consistently. There are hunters, which are machines optimized for pursuit and elimination of human targets. There are builders, which seem to be involved in constructing or maintaining Ark infrastructure. There are defenders, which protect specific locations or assets. And then there is a category that does not map cleanly onto any of those functions, a category of machines that seem to be doing all of those things simultaneously or sequentially, depending on circumstances. The Matriarch belongs to this last category. Understanding why the Matriarch does not fit neatly into any single functional category is important for understanding what it actually is. A pure defender would not need the ability to summon additional units. A pure commander would not need the offensive capabilities that the Matriarch clearly possesses. A pure destroyer would not need the kind of protective systems that make the Matriarch so difficult to damage directly. The combination of all these capabilities in a single unit points towards something more complex, a machine that was designed to maintain a complex operation in a contested environment where multiple things need to happen simultaneously, and where the specific threat profile can change rapidly. The surface environments where raiders operate are shaped by the Ark presence in ways that go beyond the obvious destruction. Areas with high Ark activity develop particular characteristics over time. Plant life, where it still exists, grows differently around Ark infrastructure. The machines seem to release compounds that affect the local environment, sometimes in ways that are consistent with making the area more hostile to humans, and sometimes in ways that are harder to interpret. The gas mines that the Matriarch deploys are the most dramatic example of this environmental modification, but they are not the only one. The Matriarch's presence changes the environment in multiple ways simultaneously. The ecological impact of Ark activity is one of the less discussed aspects of the law, but one of the more revealing ones. The Ark machines are not passive occupiers. They are actively reshaping the world they have taken over, and the direction of that reshaping is not random. Certain kinds of environments seem to be preserved or even cultivated by Ark activity, while others are systematically destroyed. This selective approach to environmental modification suggests a goal, or a set of goals, that the Ark are working toward, and the Matriarch, as a high-level command unit, is presumably involved in implementing those goals in its operational area. The raiders who have studied Ark behavior most carefully have noticed that Matriarch units tend to be found in areas that have particular strategic or infrastructural significance, not always in the most heavily defended areas, and not always in the areas with the highest concentrations of other Ark units, but in areas that have some specific quality that makes them important. Sometimes this is proximity to a large piece of surviving pre-Ark infrastructure. Sometimes it is a particular geographic feature. Sometimes it is less obvious, and the significance of the location only becomes apparent after extended observation. But the pattern is consistent enough that experienced raiders treat a Matriarch sighting as a data point about the location itself, not just about the immediate threat. The question of what the Matriarch is protecting, when it is protecting something rather than actively patrolling, is one of the central mysteries of Ark Raiders lore. The game does not give a clean answer, and I suspect that is intentional. But the evidence available suggests that the things Matriarchs protect are connected to Ark infrastructure in a specific way, that they are not just random assets but nodes in whatever larger system the Ark are building or maintaining. Understanding this positions the Matriarch not as an isolated commander, but as a functional component in something much larger than any single battlefield. The first time most raiders encounter a Matriarch, the experience is shaped heavily by the shock of its scale and the visual impact of its systems. The blue force shield is immediately apparent, the glowing red core is visible through it, and the combination creates a visual language that is simultaneously obvious and misleading. The obvious reading is that the shield protects the weak point, that the goal is to get through the shield and hit the core. The misleading part is that this framing suggests the Matriarch is primarily a combat puzzle to be solved rather than a command entity to be understood. Treating it only as a combat puzzle keeps you alive in the short term, but limits your understanding of what you are actually dealing with. The sound design around the Matriarch is worth noting even in a lore-focused discussion because it carries information. The machine does not simply make noise as a byproduct of its operation. The sounds it produces change based on its behavioral state, and experienced raiders have learned to use those sound cues as early warning systems. There is a particular sound the Matriarch makes when it is calling in additional units, different from the sound it makes when it is actively engaging a target, different again from the sound it makes during what appears to be a patrol or maintenance mode. These distinctions matter tactically, but they also matter for what they tell us about the machine's cognitive architecture. A machine that has distinct behavioral states with distinct sound signatures is a machine that is communicating something, if not to human observers, then to other machines in its network. The Matriarch sounds are most likely a form of signal, and the fact that other Ark units respond to those signals in consistent ways confirms this interpretation. When the Matriarch enters what raiders call its summoning mode, the behavioral changes in nearby Ark units are immediate and coordinated in ways that would require some form of real-time communication. The Matriarch is talking to them, and they are listening and responding. This communication capacity is one of the things that most clearly distinguishes the Matriarch from lower-tier Ark units, and one of the things that makes it so valuable to the Ark network as a whole. Individual Ark units can be isolated and destroyed without significantly affecting the broader network. A Matriarch is different. Its destruction has observable effects on the behavior of Ark units in a relatively large area around it, effects that can persist for some time after the machine itself is gone. This suggests that the Matriarch's communication role is not just tactical, but also structural, that it plays a part in maintaining the coherence of the Ark network in its operational area. The structural role of the Matriarch in the Ark network is something that becomes clearer the longer you spend studying Ark behavior patterns across different areas of the map. There is a kind of organized quality to Ark operations that extends beyond what individual units can explain. Units in different areas seem to be aware of each other in ways that suggest shared information, and the timing of certain arc activities across large distances is too coordinated to be coincidental. The Matriarch, based on what we can observe about its communication behavior, is one of the mechanisms through which this large-scale coordination is achieved. The implications of this are significant. If the Matriarch functions as a network node, as well as a combat commander, then destroying one does not just remove a powerful enemy from the field, it creates a gap in the Ark network that the network will presumably attempt to fill. The speed and method of that gap filling would tell us a great deal about how robust the Ark network is and how dependent it is on any individual node. Unfortunately, the data on this is sparse and inconsistent, which may reflect genuine variation in how different Ark deployments are structured, or may reflect the difficulty of controlled observation in an active combat zone. What we do know is that the Ark network is not static. It adapts. New machines arrive to replace destroyed ones, but they do not simply replicate the behavior of what was there before. There is learning happening at some level of the system, and that learning affects how subsequent Ark units behave in areas where raiders have been active. This adaptive quality is one of the most troubling things about the Ark from the raiders' perspective, because it means that tactics which work once do not necessarily work twice, and information about Ark behavior has a shelf life that is difficult to predict. The Matriarch's role in this adaptive process is, predictably, more significant than that of lower-tier units. Its observations, its tactical responses to raider activity, its communication with the broader network, all of this presumably feeds into whatever process the Ark use to update their behavioral protocols. Every encounter with a Matriarch is therefore not just a survival challenge, but an information exchange in which both sides are learning something. And the question of who is learning faster has obvious implications for the long-term survival of the raiders and their underground communities. This is the world that the Matriarch operates in, and this is why understanding it requires more than just cataloging its weapons systems. The Matriarch is not a thing that exists in isolation. It is a thing that exists in relationship with the Ark network, with the Ark machines it commands, with the environment it is reshaping, and with the human beings who are trying to survive in that environment. All of those relationships shape what the Matriarch does and how it does it, and all of them will be relevant as we go deeper into what this machine actually is. Let us now move to the Ark themselves, because to understand the Matriarch, we first need to understand the nature of Ark machines in general, and specifically what distinguishes the higher-tier units from the lower-tier ones. This is where things start to get genuinely interesting. The Ark machines, as a category, share certain characteristics that cut across the enormous variation in their size, function, and capability. They are all mechanical in nature, though the complexity of that mechanism varies enormously. They all seem to share some form of operational goal, even if the specific manifestation of that goal differs based on the unit type. And they all seem to be connected to something larger than themselves, some network or hierarchy that shapes their behavior even when they are operating independently. The lowest tier Ark units are interesting precisely because their behavior is so legible. They do what they do in ways that are relatively easy to observe and categorize, and that legibility makes them useful as evidence for inferences about the higher tier units. If we can understand what the simple units are doing and why, we have a foundation for understanding what the more complex units are doing, even when their behavior is less obviously interpretable. Chapter 2. What are the Ark machines, and where did they come from? The Ark machines are not something that most people in the world of Ark raiders understand in any deep sense. They are a fact of life, like weather or gravity, something that shapes every decision and every plan without being fully explained or fully explainable. The raiders who spend the most time on the surface have accumulated practical knowledge about Ark behavior that is extraordinarily detailed in some areas and completely blank in others. And the pattern of those blanks is itself informative. The things they do not know about the Ark are not random. They cluster around certain questions, and those questions are the ones that would require the kind of sustained and systematic observation that the conditions on the surface make nearly impossible. The origin question is the biggest blank. Where did the Ark come from? This is something that almost every raider has a theory about, and that almost no one has reliable information about. The theories range from the straightforward, they came from space, to the more complicated, they were made by humans and then turned against us, to the genuinely strange, they have always existed and we simply provoked them into activity. None of these theories is clearly supported by the available evidence, and none of them is clearly ruled out either. The law sits in that uncertainty deliberately. What we can observe is the behavior of the machines on the surface and what that behavior implies about their design. The Ark units are clearly purpose-built for specific functions, which means there was a design process, which means there was something that did the designing. Whether that designer was human, alien, artificial, or some combination of those things is the question, and the answer has enormous implications for everything else about the Ark story. I want to spend some time on each of the main theories before we move on to the Matriarch specifically, because those theories shape how we interpret everything the Matriarch does. The most straightforward theory, the extraterrestrial origin theory, holds that the Ark machines were designed and deployed by some non-human intelligence that identified Earth as a target for some purpose. This theory is clean and consistent with the observed behavior of the Ark, particularly the initial precision of their assault on human infrastructure. An external intelligence that had observed human civilization from a distance would have the information needed to target that assault so effectively, and the apparent lack of any obvious Ark communication with human beings would be consistent with an entity that does not consider humans worth communicating with, at least not in terms they could understand. The human origin theory is more uncomfortable, but has its own evidentiary support. The Ark machines use materials and manufacturing techniques that have identifiable analogues in human technology, though scaled and refined to a degree that current human civilization could not achieve. This could mean that the Ark are the product of a much more advanced phase of human technological development, a future version of human technology that was either sent back, escaped forward, or simply represents what happens when certain design principles are followed to their logical conclusion. This theory is speculative, but not without grounding in the law details. A third possibility, and one that the game seems to hint at without fully committing to, is that the Ark machines are not the product of any single designer, but are the result of an evolutionary or emergent process. In this reading, the Ark began as something much simpler, possibly human-made technology that achieved some form of autonomy and then developed, improved, and expanded over time in ways that their original designers never intended and could not control. This theory would explain the enormous diversity of Ark unit types without requiring a single designer to have conceived all of them simultaneously. And it would also explain certain inconsistencies in Ark behavior that are hard to account for under a pure top-down design model. The emergent origin theory has a particular implication for the Matriarch that is worth flagging now. If the Ark machines evolved rather than were designed, then the Matriarch's current form and capabilities are the product of selection pressures rather than deliberate engineering choices. Every capability the Matriarch has would exist because it was adaptive in some environment or under some set of conditions. And the question of what those conditions were becomes crucial for understanding why the Matriarch is what it is. This is a very different analytical framework from the designed origin theory, and it leads to very different questions. Regardless of origin, the Ark machines as they currently exist have a structure that is worth analyzing in detail. At the base of the hierarchy are units that appear to function as sensors or scouts, gathering information about the surface environment and the location and behavior of human beings. Above them are the units that most raiders encounter most frequently, the combat drones and patrol units that make the surface so dangerous. Above those are units with more specialized functions, builders, defenders, and what appear to be communication relays. And at the top of the visible hierarchy are the command units, of which the Matriarch is the most significant example that raiders have direct contact with. The word visible in that last sentence is doing important work. The command hierarchy that raiders can observe may not be the complete hierarchy. There may be Ark units or Ark systems operating at a level above the Matriarch that are simply not visible to human observers, either because they operate at a scale or in a domain that raiders cannot access, or because they do not interact directly with human beings in ways that would make them observable. The Matriarch may be the top of what raiders can see rather than the top of what actually exists. This possibility changes how we think about the Matriarch's role significantly. If the Matriarch reports to something, If there is a layer of Ark organization above it that it is responsive to, then its behavior on the surface is not just the output of its own decision-making, but also the implementation of directives from above. The Matriarch would then be a middle manager of sorts, translating high-level Ark objectives into tactical operations and managing the units below it. This framing is consistent with its observed behavior in several ways, particularly its tendency to balance multiple different activities simultaneously rather than fully committing to any single one. The Ark units that the Matriarch commands most directly, the Rocketeers and Bastions that it can summon, represent a specific tier of the Ark hierarchy. They are more capable than basic patrol drones, but clearly subordinate to the Matriarch in terms of tactical authority. The relationship between the Matriarch and these units is not just a matter of the Matriarch being more powerful, it is a relationship of direction and response, where the Matriarch is setting parameters for the behavior of the subordinate units, and those units are operating within those parameters. Understanding how that direction works is key to understanding the Matriarch. The summoning behavior specifically, which we will cover in much more detail in a later chapter, is one of the most revealing things the Matriarch does, because it demonstrates a level of strategic thinking that goes beyond simple combat response. The Matriarch does not summon additional units when it is winning. It does not summon units randomly. It summons them when the tactical situation has reached a specific threshold, when the balance of forces on the field has shifted in a direction that the Matriarch has assessed as requiring reinforcement. That assessment is a form of judgment, and the existence of that judgment capacity is one of the most significant things we can say about the Matriarch. The question of whether Ark machine judgment constitutes something like intelligence is one that the lore of Ark Raiders does not answer directly, and I think that ambiguity is intentional. The game is not trying to tell you that the Ark machines are conscious, or that they are just robots. It is presenting you with evidence and letting you draw your own conclusions. And the evidence is genuinely ambiguous in ways that are interesting rather than frustrating. Different readings of that evidence lead to different conclusions about what the Ark machines are doing and why, and those different conclusions have different implications for what the Raiders are up against. One of the most important things to understand about Ark machines in general is that their hardware tells only part of the story. The physical systems, the weapons and shields and mobility systems are impressive but not uniquely so. What makes Ark machines truly formidable is not any individual capability, but the integration of those capabilities and the decision-making that governs how they are used. A machine with a powerful weapon that always uses that weapon in the same way is ultimately predictable and therefore manageable. A machine with a moderately powerful weapon that uses it differently based on the situation is far more dangerous because it denies you the ability to develop a reliable counter. The Ark machines, and the Matriarch in particular, consistently demonstrate this kind of situational adaptation. The Matriarch does not just have a toolkit of capabilities, it has something like a doctrine for how to use that toolkit based on current conditions. And that doctrine is not static. It updates based on what is happening around it. Raiders who approach a Matriarch encounter with a fixed plan based on previous experience sometimes find that the Matriarch is doing something they have not seen before, not because the machine has fundamentally new capabilities, but because it has applied existing capabilities in a new combination in response to the specific tactical situation. That adaptive quality is what makes the Matriarch not just a difficult encounter, but a genuinely instructive one. The arc of Ark machine complexity, if you will forgive the use of the word, runs from the simplest patrol drones to the Matriarch and whatever might exist above it. And that arc is a spectrum of increasing autonomy and increasing capacity for adaptation. At the simple end, the machines follow protocols that are fixed or nearly fixed. At the complex end, the machines are making something that looks like real-time strategic decisions based on a comprehensive model of their tactical environment. The Matriarch sits near the complex end of that spectrum, and the gap between it and the units it commands is significant enough to suggest that the hierarchy is not just a matter of degree, but of kind. When experienced raiders talk about Ark machines, they often use language that anthropomorphizes them to some degree. And while that language is imprecise, it is not entirely without basis. The Matriarch in particular is described in ways that attribute to it something like intention, something like awareness, something like a sense of territory, and of threat. Whether those descriptions reflect genuine cognitive states in the machine, or are simply the human tendency to project mental life onto things that behave in complex ways, is impossible to determine from the outside. But the behavioral evidence is consistent enough with those descriptions that dismissing them entirely would be intellectually dishonest. The Ark machines that the Matriarch commands, the Rocketeers and Bastions, are interesting in their own right and worth discussing briefly here, because understanding them helps us understand the Matriarch's command role more clearly. Rocketeers are relatively mobile units with significant offensive capacity, optimized for dealing with targets that require heavy firepower. Bastions are more defensive, designed to hold positions and provide sustained resistance against raider incursion. The combination of these two unit types, summoned and directed by a Matriarch, creates a tactical profile that covers multiple kinds of threats simultaneously, which is exactly what a command structure is supposed to do. The tactical complementarity of the units the Matriarch summons is not accidental. A machine that could only summon additional versions of itself would be adding firepower, but not capability. The Matriarch summons units that fill specific gaps in its own coverage, which suggests that it has some model of those gaps and is addressing them deliberately. That model and the deliberateness of the response is another marker of the kind of operational intelligence that distinguishes the Matriarch from lower-tier Ark units. The materials from which Ark machines are constructed are another source of lore inference, and a brief discussion here is relevant for what it tells us about the scale of the Ark operation. The machines are built from materials that are not obviously sourced from the immediate surface environment, which means that either they are bringing those materials with them from wherever they originate, or they have access to manufacturing infrastructure somewhere on the surface that we have not yet identified, or they are using materials that look exotic to human eyes but are actually available in the local environment in quantities that we have not recognized. Each of these possibilities has different implications for the Ark's operational status and their long-term prospects. The possibility of hidden manufacturing infrastructure is particularly interesting in the context of the Matriarch's role. If the Ark are building new machines, then someone or something is managing that manufacturing process, and the command units like the Matriarch are the obvious candidates for that management role. A Matriarch that is not just commanding combat operations, but also overseeing manufacturing, would have an even more central role in the Ark network than the combat behavior alone would suggest. And its protection would be even more valuable to the Ark than it is to us. As we move toward a detailed examination of the Matriarch's specific systems and behaviors, I want to establish one more contextual point that I think is important. The Ark machines are not just enemies. They are, based on the evidence, the current dominant civilization on the surface of this world. They have infrastructure, they have hierarchy, they have something that functions like culture in the sense that their behavior patterns are consistent and transmissible. Treating them as simply a threat to be defeated misses the full picture of what they are. And the Matriarch, in particular, is a machine that rewards being taken seriously as an entity rather than just as an obstacle. With that context in place, let us turn to the Matriarch itself. Chapter 3. First Sightings: How Raiders Came to Know the Matriarch. The first documented encounters with what raiders would come to call the Matriarch did not immediately make clear what they were dealing with. The machine's scale was apparent from the beginning, but scale alone was not enough to distinguish it from other large Ark units that raiders had encountered. What set the early Matriarch sightings apart in the records that survived was the behavior of the other Ark machines in its vicinity, the way those machines seemed to orient toward it, the way their patrol patterns shifted when it was present, the way they seemed to respond to it rather than simply to the tactical situation. Early raider reports of the Matriarch are interesting for what they got right and what they got wrong. The shield was recognized immediately as a significant defensive capability. The red core was identified quickly as a likely weak point, and the intuition that destroying the core would disable the machine proved broadly correct. But the interpretation of what the Matriarch was doing, what role it played in the Ark hierarchy, took much longer to develop. And in the early days, most raiders treated it simply as a very dangerous enemy, rather than as a command structure with broader implications. The evolution of raider understanding of the Matriarch is itself a kind of story. a process of gradually recognizing the significance of behaviors that were there from the beginning, but that were not understood for what they were. The gas mines, for example, were initially interpreted as a purely offensive weapon, as a way of creating zones that raiders could not use for cover or for shooting. It took time and careful observation to recognize that the placement of the gas mines also served a territorial function, that the Matriarch was not just creating obstacles, but was defining space, marking out an operational zone in ways that shaped the behavior of both human and Ark units within it. The gas mine behavior is a good example of how the Matriarch's capabilities have multiple functions simultaneously, and how the most obvious function is not always the most important one. The immediate effect of a gas mine, preventing raiders from firing from a particular position, is real and significant. But the secondary effect, the territorial definition that the mines create, is arguably more significant for understanding what the Matriarch is doing and why. A machine that is just trying to prevent raiders from shooting at it would place the mines differently than a machine that is also trying to define and control a specific operational area. The first raider who figured out that you could destroy the gas mines before they activated earned a reputation for tactical insight that survived for generations in the oral traditions of the underground communities. This discovery was significant not just because it made Matriarch encounters more survivable, but because it shifted the framing of the encounter from a purely reactive one, where raiders were responding to what the Matriarch was doing, to an active one, where raiders could shape the conditions of the encounter in advance. That shift in framing is emblematic of how raider understanding of the Matriarch developed over time, from reactive to proactive, from treating it as a force of nature to treating it as an entity with a specific logic that could be understood and worked against. The homing missiles were one of the most frightening capabilities when they were first encountered, because they removed the tactic of simply running away but worked against simpler arc weapons. Raiders who had learned that fast movement was the best response to arc fire found that this assumption did not hold against the Matriarch's missile systems, and the adjustment required a fundamental rethinking of how to approach a Matriarch encounter at all. The missiles were also, over time, recognized as more interesting than they first appeared, because their behavior in different tactical situations varied in ways that suggested they were not simply dumb homing weapons, but guided systems with something like target prioritization. The target prioritization of the Matriarch's missiles is a detail that took a long time to document carefully because it required observing enough Matriarch encounters under enough different conditions to identify the pattern. But once the pattern was recognized, it opened up tactical possibilities that had not previously existed. The missiles prioritize certain types of targets over others, and while the exact prioritization logic is not fully understood, it is consistent enough that experienced raiders can use it to manage the threat by positioning themselves and their teammates in ways that exploit the prioritization rather than fighting it. The summoning behavior, when it was first observed, was interpreted by some raiders as a sign that the Matriarch was in distress, that calling in additional units was a desperation move. This interpretation was understandable but wrong. Later observation made it clear that the Matriarch summons additional units, not when it is losing, but when it has made a tactical assessment that additional units are required to achieve its objectives efficiently. The distinction matters because it changes the strategic calculus of the encounter. A Matriarch that summons units out of desperation is a Matriarch that can be pushed. A Matriarch that summons units because it has assessed the situation and decided that doing so serves its objectives is a much more controlled and deliberate entity. The recognition of this distinction was a turning point in raider understanding of the Matriarch, because it was the point at which the machine stopped being understood primarily as a threat and started being understood primarily as a decision maker. Once you accept that the Matriarch is making decisions rather than simply reacting, the entire framework for how to approach an encounter with it changes. You start asking not just how to survive its current actions, but what decision it is trying to make and how you can influence that decision in ways that are favorable to you. The earliest raiders who dealt with Matriarchs had to develop their understanding from scratch, without the benefit of accumulated community knowledge or documented tactical analysis. The fact that any of them survived long enough to pass on what they learned is remarkable, and the information they preserved, even in the fragmentary and imperfect form of oral tradition and handwritten notes, formed the foundation of everything subsequent raider communities learned about the machine. Some of what they got wrong has been corrected over time, some of what they got right has been repeatedly validated, and some of what they observed has never been satisfactorily explained. Among the unexplained observations from early Matriarch encounters is one that appears in multiple independent accounts and is specific enough to be interesting. Several of the earliest observers noted that the Matriarch seemed to pause its active operations periodically for intervals that had no obvious tactical explanation, not to recharge or regroup in any visible sense, but simply to be still. During these pauses, the machine's systems were clearly active. The shield was up, the core was pulsing, but it was not moving, and it was not engaging. These pauses were brief, typically lasting only a few seconds, but they were consistent enough across multiple sightings that they cannot be dismissed as coincidence. The meaning of these pauses is genuinely unclear. Some raiders have interpreted them as communication events, moments when the Matriarch is transmitting or receiving information that requires a pause in other activities. Others have suggested they represent some kind of maintenance cycle, a moment of self-check that the machine performs at regular intervals. A more interesting possibility is that the pauses represent something like deliberation, a moment when the machine is processing information and updating its operational plan before continuing. None of these interpretations can be confirmed, but the behavior itself is real and consistent. The force shield that protects the Matriarch was one of the first capabilities to be systematically studied by raider communities, for the obvious reason that it was the primary obstacle to destroying the machine. The shield's properties are distinctive and specific. It is blue in color, it is impenetrable to conventional weapons fire, and it does not cover the red core in a way that prevents the core from being targeted once the shield is down. The mechanism by which the shield goes down is one of the things that has been most carefully studied and is most consistently reported, though the specific conditions for shield deactivation vary somewhat between accounts. The relationship between the shield and the core is one of the central tactical questions of any Matriarch encounter, but it also carries lore implications that go beyond tactics. The shield and the core are not just a defense system and a weak point in a game mechanical sense. They are the two most visually distinctive features of the Matriarch, and their visual prominence suggests intentionality in the design. Something about the Matriarch was designed to be seen, either the shield or the core or both, and the question of why a machine would be designed for visual distinctiveness is an interesting one. One reading is that the Matriarch's visual distinctiveness is a form of communication, that the blue shield and the red core are signals rather than incidental aesthetic choices. The blue and red color coding is consistent across Matriarch units, which means it is designed in rather than random, and consistent visual signals in machines that interact with each other have an obvious function as identification markers. The Matriarch's distinctive appearance may serve to mark it as a command unit for other Ark machines in its network, ensuring that subordinate units can identify and orient to it even in complex tactical environments. Another reading is that the Matriarch's visual distinctiveness is aimed at human observers rather than Ark machines, that the shield and the core are designed to communicate something to the raiders who encounter it. This could be a warning, a territorial marker, a demonstration of capability. In the context of the broader Ark strategy, which seems to have been designed to make human resistance as difficult as possible, a machine that signals its own invincibility through its visual design is a machine that is doing psychological work in addition to tactical work. The appearance itself becomes a weapon. The multi-legged locomotion system of the Matriarch is another feature worth examining in this context. Most large Ark combat units use locomotion systems that are more obviously optimized for speed or power. The Matriarch's multi-legged system is different, more stable and more deliberate, capable of navigating complex terrain without the rapid movement that other units employ. This locomotion profile is consistent with a machine that is not primarily optimized for pursuit or rapid response, but for sustained presence in a specific area. The Matriarch moves like something that has claimed a territory and is moving through it rather than something that is chasing a target. The stability that the multi-legged system provides also has implications for the Matriarch's combat role. A machine that is stable and deliberate in its movement is a machine that can maintain weapon accuracy and shield orientation more effectively than one that is moving rapidly. The Matriarch does not need to chase raiders because it is designing the tactical environment so that raiders are operating on its terms, within range of its weapon systems and subject to the constraints that its gas mines and summoned units impose. The locomotion system is part of that design, not a separate feature. Early attempts by raiders to find weaknesses in the Matriarch's locomotive system, trying to topple it or restrict its movement, generally failed, and the failure pattern was informative. The Matriarch's leg configuration is not just stable, but adaptively stable, meaning that the system compensates for attempts to destabilize it in ways that suggest active balance management, rather than passive structural rigidity. This adaptive stability is further evidence of the machine's sophisticated real-time processing capabilities, because maintaining balance dynamically across varied terrain while simultaneously managing weapon systems, shield functions, and tactical communications is a genuinely complex computational task. The first successful tactical frameworks for dealing with matriarchs were developed by communities that shared information freely, pooling observations from multiple encounters to identify patterns that no single raider could have identified from their own experience alone. The collaborative nature of this knowledge development is one of the more hopeful aspects of the raider experience, and it stands in interesting contrast to the Ark's apparently more centralized approach to information management. The raiders developed their understanding of the Matriarch through distributed, collaborative observation, while the Ark network seems to process information through a hierarchy that flows up and down through command nodes, like the Matriarch itself. The communities that were most successful in dealing with matriarchs were not always the ones with the best individual fighters. They were often the ones with the best information sharing practices, the ones who had developed ways of documenting encounters, distributing that documentation, and updating their tactics based on new information quickly. This organizational advantage is one of the few areas where human communities have demonstrated a consistent edge over the Ark, and it is an edge that the Ark network, through the adaptive behavior of command units like the Matriarch, appears to be actively working to close. The documentation of matriarch behavior that accumulated in raider communities over time is uneven in quality and consistency, as you would expect from records kept by people who were primarily focused on staying alive rather than on systematic observation. But certain threads run consistently through even the most fragmentary accounts, observations that appear in enough independent sources that they can be treated as reliable descriptions of the machine's actual behavior. These consistent threads are what we will be working with as we move into the detailed examination of the Matriarch's systems. What emerges from those consistent accounts is a picture of a machine that is, above all else, purposeful. The Matriarch does not waste actions. Every capability it deploys, every movement it makes, every unit it summons is connected to a purpose that the machine is working toward, even when that purpose is not immediately obvious to the humans observing it. This purposefulness is the most consistent thing about the Matriarch, and the most important thing to hold on to as we move deeper into the specifics of what it is and how it works. Chapter 4. The Blue Shield, Impenetrability, and What It Really Means. The force shield that surrounds the Matriarch is visually and tactically the first thing that demands your attention. It is blue, it is large enough to cover the machine completely, and it is, under normal circumstances, completely impenetrable to conventional weapons. These three features together create a specific kind of tactical problem, one that has shaped raider approaches to matriarch encounters more than almost any other single factor. But the shield is also one of the most lore-rich features of the matriarch, and examining it carefully reveals things about the machine that go beyond the obvious defensive function. The color of the shield is worth starting with, because color in Ark machine design is not arbitrary. The blue of the matriarch's shield is specific and consistent, the same shade across all observed matriarch units, which means it is designed in rather than incidental. The red core that glows through and beneath the shield is equally specific, and the contrast between the blue exterior shield and the red core interior creates a visual language that reads as deliberate. Blue protecting red, cool protecting hot, outer stability enclosing inner urgency. Whether that reading is meaningful or is simply a human aesthetic projection onto a machine's design is a genuinely open question. What we do know is that the shield and the core are functionally linked in ways that go beyond simple design aesthetics. The state of the shield affects the behavior of the core, and the state of the core affects the behavior of the shield. When the shield is under active pressure, the core pulses at a different frequency than when the shield is in its nominal state. When the core is under stress, the shield's behavior changes in ways that experienced observers can detect. This mutual dependency suggests that the two systems are not independent features that happen to coexist in the same machine, but integrated components of a single unified system. The mechanism of the shield itself is one of the genuine mysteries of the Matriarch, because it does not behave like any shielding technology that raider communities have been able to develop or repurpose from pre-Ark salvage. The shield is not a physical barrier in the conventional sense. It does not have a material structure that can be observed or analyzed in the way that conventional armor can be. It is an energy projection of some kind, but the specific mechanism of that projection has not been identified. This is one of those areas where the lore is genuinely blank in ways that feel like they mean something. The blankness around the shield's mechanism could simply reflect the limits of what raiders have been able to figure out with the resources available to them. But it could also reflect something deliberate about the Ark's approach to their most valuable assets. If the shield technology is something that the Ark considers strategically important, they might have reasons to design it in ways that prevent easy analysis and reverse engineering. A shield that cannot be understood, cannot be reproduced, and a defensive technology that only the Ark possess is a significant strategic advantage. The conditions under which the shield can be deactivated are the most practically important thing about it, and the thing that raider communities have studied most carefully. The precise conditions vary somewhat in the accounts, which may reflect genuine variation between individual Matriarch units, or may reflect the difficulty of controlled observation in combat conditions. But the broad pattern is consistent. The shield can be brought down. It requires specific actions or conditions to do so, and it can be restored after it goes down if the Matriarch has the opportunity to do so. The window between shield going down and shield going back up is the critical tactical window of a Matriarch encounter. The fact that the shield can go down and come back up is itself lore relevant, because it tells us something about the energy system that powers it. A shield that can be fully restored after being taken down is a shield with access to a significant and replenishable energy source, not a finite battery that gets depleted and does not recover. This implies either that the Matriarch carries an extremely efficient energy generation system, or that it has access to external power, possibly through the Ark network. Either possibility has interesting implications for the machine's architecture and its relationship to the broader Ark infrastructure. The impenetrability of the shield to conventional weapons is worth unpacking slightly, because the word conventional is doing real work in that description. The shield stops bullets, explosives, and energy weapons that raiders typically have access to. What it does not stop, presumably, is whatever is required to bring it down under the right conditions. The mechanism of shield deactivation therefore tells us something about the limits of the shield, about what kind of energy or force it cannot block. This is a specific and potentially important weakness, not just tactically but in terms of understanding what the shield technology is and where it comes from. The visual effect of weapons fire impacting the shield is another source of information. The shield does not simply absorb or deflect projectiles silently. The impact creates a visible and audible response, a ripple or pulse through the blue energy field that indicates something is happening at the point of impact, even if the weapon is not doing damage in the conventional sense. This reactive quality suggests that the shield is an active system that is responding to impacts rather than a passive barrier, and the nature of that response, the specific visual and audible signature it produces, varies based on the type of weapon being used. Experienced raiders have learned to read the shield's impact responses as information about the state of the system. A shield that is responding to multiple simultaneous impacts in a specific way may be closer to deactivation than one that is absorbing the same firepower with no visible distress. The skill of reading the shield's state from its visual and audible responses is one of the markers of experienced raider tactical judgment, and it is a skill that is difficult to develop without extensive and dangerous practical experience. The lore of the shield, in this sense, is not just descriptive, but instructive. It is a record of hard-won knowledge about a system that kills people who do not understand it. The relationship between the shield and the Matriarch's other systems during active combat is revealing. The shield does not simply exist passively around the machine while everything else is happening. It is actively managed, with the Matriarch making adjustments to coverage and intensity based on the tactical situation. This active management is another demonstration of the machine's sophisticated real-time processing capabilities, because managing a dynamic energy shield while simultaneously operating weapon systems, deploying gas mines, communicating with the Ark network, and summoning and directing additional units is a genuinely impressive level of multitasking. The active management of the shield also means that raiders can, in principle, influence the shield's behavior by forcing the Matriarch to distribute its attention and energy across multiple demands simultaneously. A Matriarch that is under pressure from multiple directions at once may be managing its shield less efficiently than one that is dealing with a single focused threat. This observation has shaped raider tactical thinking around the Matriarch significantly, encouraging approaches that maximize simultaneous pressure on multiple of the machine's systems, rather than focusing everything on a single point of attack. The shield's relationship to the gas mines that the Matriarch deploys is one of the more subtle tactical interactions in a Matriarch encounter. The gas mines prevent raiders from shooting from certain positions, which effectively channels their fire towards positions where it is easier for the shield to manage. The interplay between mine placement and shield coverage suggests a level of integrated tactical planning that is not immediately obvious but becomes apparent once you have seen enough Matriarch encounters to recognize the pattern. The Matriarch is not just using each capability independently, but using them in combination to create a tactical environment that maximizes the effectiveness of each one. The impenetrability of the shield has psychological effects on raiders that go beyond the purely tactical challenge it represents. There is something deeply discouraging about encountering a thing that simply cannot be hurt, and the experience of pouring fire into the Matriarch's shield and watching it have no effect creates a specific kind of demoralization that is not present when the problem is simply that something is difficult to hit or difficult to damage. The shield communicates invulnerability in a way that is almost communicative, almost as if the machine is making a point about the futility of the raider's position. Whether that psychological effect is intentional in the design of the shield is another question that cannot be answered with confidence, but the consistency of the effect across different raider communities and different individual responses suggests that it is real and that it is not trivial. The Ark machines, and particularly the Matriarch, seem to be designed not just to defeat raiders, but to defeat them in ways that are as demoralizing as possible, that communicate the futility of resistance in addition to simply making resistance difficult. If that is intentional, then it represents a level of psychological sophistication in the design that is as impressive as any of the technical capabilities. The lore implications of a machine that is designed to be psychologically intimidating go beyond the immediate tactical situation. A machine designed to demoralize is a machine designed to prevent future resistance, not just to defeat current resistance. The Matriarch's shield, in this reading, is not just a defensive system, but part of a broader behavioral modification campaign aimed at reshaping human psychology in ways that favor Ark dominance. Whether that campaign is working is a question the lore does not answer directly, but the existence of the raiders themselves, the fact that people keep going to the surface despite everything, suggests that it is not fully successful. The blue shield also interacts with the environment in ways that are worth noting. In areas with certain lighting conditions or weather effects, the shield's visibility changes, and this can affect both tactical decisions and the shield's psychological impact. Raiders who have encountered Matriarchs in heavy rain or fog report that the blue glow of the shield is both more and less visible under those conditions, creating a strange visual effect that some describe as disorienting. Whether the Ark designers anticipated these environmental interactions and accounted for them in the shield's design is unknown, but the fact that the shield maintains its function regardless of environmental conditions confirms that it is not a simple optical phenomenon, but a robust energy system. The power consumption required to maintain a field like the Matriarch's shield continuously during an active combat encounter is something that raider communities have tried to estimate based on observable evidence. The specific numbers are obviously impossible to pin down without access to Ark engineering data, but the qualitative observation is consistent. The shield is extraordinarily energy intensive, and maintaining it under pressure must be one of the dominant demands on the Matriarch's power budget. This energy demand has implications for how the Matriarch balances its various systems, because every bit of power going to the shield is power not going to the weapons systems or the communication array. The balancing act implied by the shield's energy demands is another place where the Matriarch's sophisticated processing capabilities become important. A machine that simply divides its power budget equally among all systems regardless of the situation would be both less effective as a combatant and less dangerous as a command entity. A machine that dynamically reallocates power based on the current tactical situation, boosting the shield when incoming fire is intense and diverting power elsewhere when the immediate threat level drops, would behave in ways that are much more consistent with what raiders actually observe. The shield's behavior during Matriarch encounters is consistent with dynamic power management rather than static allocation. One of the more interesting observations about the Matriarch's shield is what happens to it in the moments before the Matriarch deploys gas mines or summons additional units. Some accounts describe a brief but detectable change in the shield's behavior, a subtle shift in the energy field that precedes these actions by a fraction of a second. If this observation is reliable, it suggests that the shield and the other systems are sharing resources in a way that creates detectable signatures that the preparation for a significant action like summoning draws energy from the shield in a way that an observant raider might be able to detect and respond to. This kind of micro-level behavioral prediction is the most advanced form of tactical engagement with the Matriarch, the ability to read the machine's imminent actions from subtle real-time cues rather than waiting for those actions to manifest fully. The raiders who have developed this capability are a small and particularly experienced subset, but their existence confirms that the Matriarch's behavior, sophisticated as it is not completely inscrutable. It can be read, it can be predicted to some degree, and it can therefore be worked with, rather than simply reacted to. The relationship between the shield and the core goes deeper than just the tactical interaction, the shield protecting the core while the core powers the shield. There is something more fundamental being expressed in that arrangement, something about the architecture of the Matriarch that the shield-core relationship embodies. The core is what the Matriarch is, at some level, the source of its processing and its power. The shield is what the Matriarch projects into the world, the barrier it places between its essential self and everything that might threaten it. That framing might sound philosophical, and I do not want to overreach here, but the consistency of the shield core pairing across all Matriarch units suggests that it is a fundamental design choice rather than an incidental feature. Chapter 5. The glowing red core, the heart of the machine. The red core of the Matriarch is the machine's most significant point of vulnerability, and also, based on what we can observe about it, the center of everything the Matriarch is. It pulses. It changes intensity based on the machine's behavioral state. It responds to external pressures in ways that suggest it is connected to every other system the Matriarch operates. And it is the one thing that, when sufficiently damaged, can actually stop the Matriarch from functioning. Understanding the core is understanding the Matriarch in a fundamental sense. The color is the first thing that demands interpretation. The red core against the blue shield creates a specific visual contrast that is present in every Matriarch encounter, consistent enough to be treated as a designed feature. Red in human visual culture carries associations with heat, danger, and vitality that are fairly universal, though projecting human cultural associations onto Ark design choices is obviously not a reliable method of analysis. More relevant is the functional implication of the redness, which may indicate the thermal output of whatever process the core is performing. If the core is a high-output energy system, the redness could simply be the visible spectrum of the heat it produces. The pulsing behavior of the core is one of its most distinctive features, and one of the most information-rich. The pulse is not uniform. Its rate, intensity, and pattern change based on what the Matriarch is doing and the state of its various systems. When the Matriarch is in a low-activity state, the pulse is slow and regular. When the machine is actively engaged in combat, the pulse becomes more rapid and irregular. When the shield is taking heavy fire, the core's pulse changes in a specific way. When the Matriarch is preparing to summon additional units, the core's pulse changes in a different way. The core is the Matriarch's heartbeat. in a very real sense, and reading it gives you information about the machine's physiological state. The analogy to a heartbeat is imperfect but useful. A human heartbeat carries information about the body's state, responding to stress, exertion, and rest in ways that are diagnostically valuable. The Matriarch's core pulse does something similar, responding to the machine's operational state in ways that are consistent enough to be read as information rather than just as noise. The difficulty is that reading that information requires experience and proximity, both of which come with significant risks in a Matriarch encounter. The raiders, who have spent enough time close to functioning Matriarchs to learn to read the core pulse, are a small and self-selected group. The core's relationship to the Matriarch's weapon systems is one of the clearer functional connections that can be observed. When the Matriarch fires its homing missiles, the core's energy output changes in a specific way, a brief intensification that precedes the actual launch. This sequence, the core change followed by the launch, suggests that the missile systems draw power from the core and that the core ramps up that power output in anticipation of the demand. This is consistent with a machine that has a single central power source managing the demands of multiple systems, and it is further evidence that the core is the hub of the Matriarch's energy architecture. The gas mine deployment also correlates with core state changes, though the signature is different from the missile launch signature. Gas mine deployment seems to require less power than the missile systems, but is preceded by a different kind of core activation that suggests it involves a different power draw mechanism. The mine deployment signature is one of the easiest of the core state changes to learn to recognize, partly because of its relatively low intensity, and partly because it occurs frequently enough during a typical Matriarch encounter that raiders get multiple opportunities to observe it. Recognizing the mine deployment signature before the mines actually appear can give a raider a brief but significant advantage in avoiding them. The core's role in the Matriarch's communication functions is harder to observe directly, but is implied by certain behavioral patterns. The pauses in Matriarch activity that early raiders documented, the brief periods of stillness during which the machine appears to be doing nothing while its core pulses in a specific pattern, are the most direct evidence of a communication-related core function. During these pauses, the core's pulse takes on a different quality that raiders have described as more organized or rhythmic than the activity-related pulse patterns. If this observation is reliable, it suggests that the communication process involves a specific kind of core activation that is distinct from the activation patterns associated with weapons and defense systems. The core's vulnerability is interesting in the context of everything else we know about Ark machine design. The Ark machines are, as a general principle, built to be difficult to destroy. They are physically robust, tactically sophisticated, and in the Matriarch's case, protected by an apparently impenetrable energy shield. The decision to include a specific targetable weak point in the form of the glowing red core might seem to contradict that general design philosophy. But it only contradicts it if you assume that the weak point was not intended, if you assume that the core's vulnerability is a flaw rather than a design choice. The possibility that the core's vulnerability is a design choice is worth taking seriously. A machine that has no vulnerable point at all is a machine that cannot be serviced, maintained, or modified by whatever built it. If the Ark machines require maintenance or modification at some point in their operational life, then having a designated access point, something that can be targeted and opened, would be functionally necessary. The core might be the Matriarch's maintenance point, the designated location where its builders can interact with its central systems. And the fact that this maintenance point is a weak point in combat might be an acceptable trade-off from the designer's perspective, rather than a flaw in the design. This reading has implications for how we think about the relationship between the Matriarch and whatever built it. If the core is a maintenance point, then it is a point of contact between the Matriarch and its builders, a physical interface that preserves the builder's ability to access and modify the machine even after it has been deployed. A machine with such a point of contact is, in some sense, not fully autonomous, because the builders retain the ability to intervene in its operation through that contact point. The Matriarch's apparent autonomy in the field might therefore be autonomy within limits set by whoever or whatever holds access to its core. The red glow of the core when the machine is operational compared to what happens to that glow when the Matriarch is under extreme stress or on the verge of destruction, is one of the more dramatic visual details of a Matriarch encounter. The color intensifies, the pulsing becomes erratic. The quality of the light changes in ways that experienced raiders describe as different, in a way that is hard to put into words, but that you recognize once you have seen it. This intensification pattern is one of the clearest visual cues that the machine is close to destruction, and recognizing it matters because the Matriarch's behavior changes significantly when it is critically damaged. A critically damaged Matriarch does not simply become more vulnerable, it becomes more dangerous in specific ways. The weapon systems go into something like overdrive, the summoning behavior escalates, the machine becomes less predictable in its movement. This escalation pattern is consistent with a machine that has damage response protocols built into its behavioral architecture, protocols that trigger when the core reaches a certain damage threshold and that are designed to maximize the machine's combat effectiveness, even at the cost of sustainability. A machine that is dying and knows it fights differently than a machine that is confident in its survival. The ethical dimension of destroying the Matriarch's core is something that the lore of Ark Raiders does not engage with directly, but the existence of the core as a thing with evident vitality, something that pulses and responds and in some sense seems alive, raises questions that hover in the background of every Matriarch encounter. The raiders who deal with these machines are not generally in a position to indulge those questions in the field. Survival comes first. But the oral traditions and documentation that raider communities have developed around the Matriarch carry traces of a more complicated emotional response to the machine than simple fear or hostility. Some raider accounts describe a moment in a successful Matriarch destruction where the core goes dark, the pulse stops, and there is a brief period of strange quiet before the machine's mechanical systems begin to shut down. This moment is described with a consistency and a weight that suggests it is experienced as more than just a tactical achievement, that it registers as something more significant. Whether that significance is purely psychological, the relief of surviving an extremely dangerous encounter, or whether it reflects something real about what the Matriarch is a question that the lore leaves open. The afterglow of a destroyed Matriarch's core, the brief persistence of a dim red light after the machine has ceased functioning, is one of those small details that appears in multiple independent accounts and therefore deserves attention. A core that does not go completely dark immediately upon the machine's destruction, but rather fades gradually over a period of seconds or minutes, is a core that still has some energy in it, still has some process running, even after the machine that housed it has stopped. What process that is, and what its running serves after the machine is dead, is genuinely mysterious. The red core is ultimately the most intimate piece of the Matriarch. Everything else about the machine, the shield, the weapons, the legs, the communication systems, all of these are extensions of what the core is doing. The core is the source of the power, the source of the processing, and the source of whatever it is that makes the Matriarch function the way it functions. To destroy the core is to end whatever the Matriarch is. And the fact that this ending requires so much effort and risk from the raiders who attempt it says something about how much is invested in the core by the machine that carries it. Chapter 6. Gas Mines, Territorial Control, and what the Matriarch is claiming. The gas mines that the Matriarch deploys are on the surface level a straightforward tactical tool. They create zones where raiders cannot fire effectively, which limits their options and forces them into positions that serve the Matriarch's tactical interests. This surface-level reading is accurate and important, but it is not the complete picture. The gas mines are, as I mentioned briefly in an earlier chapter, also a form of territorial marking, and understanding them in that way opens up some of the most interesting questions in Matriarch lore. Territory, in the Ark context, means something specific. It is not territory in the human political sense, not a claim based on history or legal convention or force of arms. Ark territorial behavior, to the extent it can be observed, seems to be functional in nature, a machine marking out the space it needs to perform whatever function it is performing. When the Matriarch deploys gas mines in a particular pattern around a particular location, it is not simply defending itself. It is defining an operational space, setting parameters for the kind of activity that can occur within a certain radius of whatever the Matriarch is doing or protecting. The patterns of gas mine deployment are not random. Raiders who have documented multiple Matriarch encounters have noted that the deployment patterns are consistent in ways that go beyond simple tactical geometry. The mines are not simply placed to block the most obvious shooting positions, they are placed to define a specific shape of exclusion zone around the Matriarch. And that shape is consistent enough across different encounters in different environments to suggest that it is the intended shape rather than a reaction to the specific tactical situation. The Matriarch is trying to create a specific kind of space around itself, not just trying to make things difficult for whoever is attacking it. The specific shape of the exclusion zone that the Matriarch's gas mines create is worth analyzing in detail, though I want to be clear that the analysis here is inferential rather than definitive. Based on documented deployment patterns, the mines tend to be placed in ways that create clear corridors of movement within the exclusion zone while blocking others. This is not the pattern you would expect from a purely defensive deployment, which would aim to block all approaches. It is the pattern you would expect from a machine that wants certain kinds of movement within its operational space while preventing others, that wants to control the flow of activity in its zone rather than simply prevent activity. The gas itself, the substance that the mines release, is worth examining beyond its purely tactical effect. The gas prevents effective fire within the affected area, but it does not immediately incapacitate raiders who enter it. This specific effect profile is interesting because it is selective in a way that has tactical and lore implications. A gas that simply killed everything it contacted would be a more indiscriminate weapon. A gas that selectively impairs combat effectiveness while leaving the target functional enough to move suggests something about the intent behind its design. It is a control tool rather than a kill tool. The selectivity of the gas's effect is one of the things that has led some raiders to speculate about non-obvious functions for the mines. If the gas is not primarily intended to kill, but to control behavior, then what behavior is it trying to control? And toward what end? One possibility is that the gas serves a purpose beyond the immediate tactical encounter, that its presence in an area for an extended period has effects on the environment or on human behavior that serve the Ark's broader goals rather than just the Matriarch's immediate combat objectives. This is speculative, but the selectivity of the gas's effect makes it worth considering. The Matriarch's ability to place multiple gas mines simultaneously or in rapid succession is a significant tactical challenge because it means that the Matriarch can rapidly reshape the tactical landscape within its operational area. A Matriarch that is being pressed from multiple directions does not simply absorb the pressure, it responds by deploying mines that change the geometry of the encounter, forcing raiders to reposition in ways that may inadvertently move them into less favorable positions. The speed of this reshaping capability is one of the things that makes the Matriarch so difficult to fight as a coordinated group, because individual raiders adjusting to mine placements may end up in positions that conflict with each other or that expose new vulnerabilities. The placement of gas mines relative to the positions of summoned Ark units is another layer of tactical integration that reveals something about the Matriarch's operational planning. The mines do not simply define the Matriarch's personal space. They are often placed in ways that channel raiders toward the summoned units, or that protect the summoned units from raiders who would otherwise have a direct line of fire on them. This coordinated deployment, mines and summoned units working together to create a specific tactical geometry, is strong evidence that the Matriarch is operating with a comprehensive model of the battlefield, rather than just responding to immediate threats. The question of how quickly raiders can adapt to the Matriarch's mine deployment is one of the more tactically rich aspects of the encounter. But it also has lore relevance, the adaptations that raiders develop, the tactics for clearing mines, for avoiding mine deployment patterns, for anticipating where mines will be placed. All of these represent knowledge that the raiders acquire and transmit. But the Matriarch, as we have established, also adapts. The mine deployment patterns that have been successfully countered tend to shift in subsequent encounters. Not dramatically, but enough to invalidate specific counter tactics. This suggests that information about successful raider adaptations reaches the Matriarch in some form and influences its mine deployment logic. The mechanism by which such information would reach the Matriarch is unclear, but the most likely explanation involves the Ark network. If the Ark network collects and distributes information about raider tactics across all Ark command units, Then a matriarch in one location would have access to information about what worked and what did not work in encounters with matriarchs in other locations. This would explain how deployment patterns adapt without requiring each individual matriarch to independently experience and respond to every counter tactic. The network is learning even when individual units are not directly involved in the encounters. Where the learning happens, this network-level learning is one of the most troubling implications of the matriarch's mind deployment behavior, because it suggests that information generated in one raider community's encounters with Ark machines may be used against other raider communities that have never deployed the same tactics. A tactic that works once, anywhere, may be countered everywhere relatively quickly if the network is efficient at distributing the relevant information. The practical implication is that tactical innovation among raiders needs to be continuous rather than episodic, because any particular innovation has a limited shelf life. The territorial dimension of mind deployment raises a question about what the matriarch is doing with the space it defines. If the minds are creating an operational zone rather than just a defensive perimeter, then the machine is presumably performing some operation within that zone. But what operation? The matriarch is not stationary. It moves within its operational area, and its movements are not random. There is a pattern to how it moves, a set of positions it returns to, and routes it follows, and the mind deployment patterns tend to be organized around these movement patterns. The idea that the matriarch has preferred positions within its operational area is one of the most interesting aspects of its territorial behavior. These positions seem to be selected for specific qualities rather than randomly. Some are elevated, giving the matriarch a clear line of sight across its operational area. Some are centrally located within the mind deployment pattern, maximizing the defensive value of the mines. Some are proximate to specific environmental features, buildings, structures, or geographic elements that seem to have some significance to the matriarch's operation. The selection of these positions is not obviously tactical in all cases, and the non-obvious cases are the most interesting. The positions that the matriarch returns to, that are not obviously tactically advantageous, might be locations with functional significance to the Ark network. Access points to Ark infrastructure, communication relay positions, locations where environmental monitoring or modification is occurring. If the matriarch is performing a specific function at these non-obvious positions, then the mind deployment that protects those positions is protecting that function, not just protecting the machine. This would mean that destroying the matriarch at one of these positions might reveal something about what the function was, and might have effects on the Ark network that go beyond the tactical impact of losing a command unit. The gas mines themselves, as physical objects, are interesting in their design. They are Ark technology, but they share certain design elements with other Ark devices that suggest they were developed within a consistent design framework. The mechanism of their detonation, triggered by proximity, is straightforward, but the mechanism by which they release the inhibiting gas is more specific than a simple explosive dispersal. The gas seems to be released in a controlled pattern that maximizes coverage while minimizing the concentration at any single point, which would reduce the risk of unintended Ark unit incapacitation. The possibility that Ark units can be affected by the matriarch's own gas mines is significant if true, because it implies a constraint on how the matriarch uses them that has not been fully explored in Raider tactical analysis. A weapon that also threatens your own units must be deployed with care, and the constraints that care imposes on deployment patterns would be informative about the gas mine's effect on Ark units versus humans. If Ark units are more resistant to the gas, the deployment patterns would reflect that. If Ark units are equally affected, the mines would need to be placed in ways that protect them too. The actual observed deployment patterns suggest the latter, which has implications for the gas's mechanism. The mine deployment is also connected to the matriarch summoning behavior in ways that experienced raiders have noted. Matriarchs tend to deploy gas mines before summoning additional units, and the mine deployment pattern tends to create safe corridors through which the summoned units can approach without being exposed to their own matriarch's mines. This pre-summoning mine deployment is one of the clearest examples of the matriarch's integrated tactical planning, the anticipation of a future action, and the preparation of the environment for that action before the action occurs. The fact that the matriarch pre-deploys mines to prepare for summoning raises interesting questions about how far ahead its planning extends. A machine that plans a few seconds ahead is doing something very different from a machine that plans a few minutes ahead, and the difference matters enormously for how you engage with it tactically. Observational evidence suggests that the Matriarch's planning horizon is variable, that it plans further ahead in some situations than others, and that the conditions that trigger longer horizon planning are connected to the machine's assessment of the overall tactical situation. When it perceives a significant and sustained threat, it plans further ahead. When it perceives the situation as stable, it operates with a shorter planning horizon. This variable planning horizon is consistent with an intelligent system that allocates processing resources based on need, investing more in planning when the tactical situation is more complex and uncertain. It is also consistent with a system that distinguishes between types of threats and allocates different response strategies to each. A quick, light radar probe that the Matriarch assesses as low threat might trigger a limited and immediate response. A sustained, coordinated radar assault might trigger a comprehensive response plan that involves mine deployment, summoning, shield management, and weapons fire in a coordinated sequence. The difference in response quality reflects the Matriarch's assessment of the situation, and the accuracy of that assessment is one of the machine's most dangerous capabilities. Chapter 7. The Homing Missiles: Speed, Precision, and the Hunt. The homing missiles that the Matriarch deploys represent one of the clearest expressions of its offensive philosophy, which is not brute force but precision and persistence. The missiles are fast, they track, they are not the kind of weapon you can dodge with a simple sidestep or outrun with a sprint. They require specific and knowledgeable responses to survive, and developing those responses is one of the most important things a raider can learn about fighting the Matriarch. The speed of the missiles is worth quantifying in relative terms, even without precise measurements, because it matters for the tactical responses that work against them. They are fast enough that by the time you see them in the air, you have very little time to react with anything other than a pre-planned response. This puts a premium on anticipating the launch rather than responding to it, which brings us back to the importance of reading the Matriarch's behavioral cues before the missiles are deployed. A raider who can tell when the Matriarch is about to launch is in a fundamentally better position than one who is reacting to missiles already in flight. The homing capability of the missiles is the feature that makes them most dangerous, because it eliminates the most basic survival tactic of simply moving out of the way. A missile that homes in on its target is a missile that requires the target to either intercept it or outmaneuver it in a way that causes it to miss, and neither option is trivial when the missile is both fast and persistent. The specific homing algorithm the missiles use, the way they adjust their trajectory to follow a moving target, is sophisticated enough that simple evasive maneuvers do not work reliably. More complex maneuvers, ones that exploit the limits of the homing algorithm, are required. The limits of the homing algorithm are one of the areas where raider community knowledge is most practically valuable. There are specific movement patterns and terrain features that can cause the missiles to lose their track or to impact something other than their intended target. These counters exist because no homing system is perfect, and the Ark, despite their evident technological sophistication, have built missiles with exploitable limitations. Whether those limitations are design choices or genuine flaws in the system is unclear, but their consistent existence across multiple independent Matriarch encounters confirms that they are real and reliable. The target prioritization system of the missiles is separate from the homing algorithm and arguably more strategically significant. The missiles do not simply attack the nearest target or the target that presents the most immediate threat. They follow a prioritization logic that is consistent enough to be exploited, but complex enough that the full logic has not been definitively established. The pattern that has been most reliably observed is a preference for targets that the Matriarch has assessed as high threat, meaning targets that are actively attacking the core or have a clear line of attack on the shield's weak points. This prioritization is intelligent in a tactical sense, directing the missiles toward the threats that are most dangerous to the machine rather than the threats that are most accessible. The implication of intelligent target prioritization for raider tactics is significant. If the missiles go after the raiders who are most threatening to the Matriarch, then the raiders who are less actively engaged, and therefore lower threat, become de facto missile shields for the more active attackers. This creates a natural coordination pressure in raider groups fighting a Matriarch, where the roles and positions of different raiders need to account for how the Matriarch is prioritizing its missile targeting. Raiders who understand this dynamic can use it strategically, managing their threat profiles to control which of them the missiles go after at any given moment. The relationship between missile deployment and shield state is another layer of integration that reveals the Matriarch's tactical sophistication. The Matriarch tends to deploy missiles more aggressively when its shield is fully operational, and less aggressively when the shield is under pressure, which suggests that it is managing its energy budget in real time and prioritizing defensive systems when they are most needed. This also means that the tactical situation in which missiles are most densely deployed is the situation in which the shield is most fully powered, compounding the challenge for raiders who are trying to simultaneously push through the shield and avoid the missiles. The sound of the missile launch is one of the most reliable early warning signals that experienced raiders use, and the specific audio signature of the launch has been documented carefully in raider community records because of its obvious practical importance. The sound is distinctive, different from the sounds associated with mine deployment, summoning, or shield management, and it precedes the visual confirmation of missiles in flight by a perceptible interval. Raiders who have trained themselves to respond to the sound rather than waiting for the visual confirmation gain a crucial fraction of a second of additional response time. And in a Matriarch encounter, that fraction of a second can be the difference between an evasion that works and one that does not. The missile's interaction with the terrain of the operational area is another tactical dimension that has been studied extensively. The missiles follow their targets, but they do not pass through solid objects, and terrain features that can be interposed between a missile and its target can cause the missile to detonate prematurely or to lose its lock. This environmental interaction is one of the most reliable missile countermeasures available in most Matriarch encounter zones, but it requires knowledge of the local terrain and the presence of appropriate features. Open terrain encounters with a Matriarch are significantly more dangerous precisely because the terrain countermeasures are not available. The recharge time between missile volleys is another tactically significant detail, one that defines a rhythm in the encounter that experienced raiders learn to use. After a volley of missiles is deployed and resolved, there is a period during which the Matriarch cannot launch another volley, and this period represents one of the safer windows for closing distance on the machine or for attempting coordinated shield damage. The length of this window varies, and the variation correlates with the Matriarch's overall operational state, being longer when the machine is managing other complex demands and shorter when it is in a relatively stable state. Learning to predict the recharge window is therefore connected to learning to read the Matriarch's overall state, which is the same skill required for many other aspects of the encounter. The psychological impact of homing missiles is worth discussing alongside the tactical dimensions because it shapes raider behavior in ways that go beyond the immediate tactical challenge. The experience of being tracked by a missile, of not being able to simply run, and knowing that evasion requires specific knowledge and execution, creates a particular kind of stress response that is different from the stress of being shot at with conventional weapons. It is more personal, it is more persistent, and it is the kind of stress that can cause even experienced raiders to make mistakes under the pressure of a Matriarch encounter in ways that they would not make under other kinds of arc fire. Managing that stress response is, in a sense, another skill that raider training tries to develop, the ability to think clearly under the specific kind of pressure that homing missiles create. The training approaches that different raider communities use for this vary, but the consistent element is exposure, the development of familiarity with the experience of being tracked that reduces its novelty and therefore its capacity to disrupt decision-making. This is not comfortable to develop, for obvious reasons, and the training approaches involve significant risk, even when they are carefully designed. But the raiders who emerge from this training with genuine missile composure are significantly more effective against a Matriarch than those who have not. The missile's design as a weapon system tells us something about the Ark's assessment of the threat that human raiders represent. A missile that tracks and pursues is a missile designed for a target that moves, that tries to evade, that is intelligent enough to attempt countermeasures. You do not build homing missiles to fight a static or predictable target. You build them because your target is unpredictable and evasive, because simple ballistic weapons are not sufficient. The Ark's investment in homing missile capability is, in a way, a compliment to the raiders, an acknowledgement that human beings are difficult enough targets that the machines needed to develop sophisticated tracking systems to deal with them effectively. The number of missiles in a typical Matriarch volley is a variable that's been documented across multiple encounters, and the variation in that number is informative. Larger volleys tend to occur when the Matriarch is facing multiple targets simultaneously, with the number of missiles apparently scaled to the number of significant threats in the immediate environment. This scaling behavior is another marker of the machine's sophisticated assessment capabilities, the ability to count and prioritize threats and allocate missile resources accordingly. A machine that can only fire a fixed volley regardless of how many targets it is dealing with is a simpler machine than one that calibrates its response to the specific threat profile it is facing. The relationship between the missiles and the summoned units that the Matriarch brings into the encounter is tactically important and lore-relevant. The missiles are a Matriarch-specific capability, not shared by the Rocketeers and Bastions it summons. This means that the different elements of the Matriarch's force have different offensive profiles that complement each other. The Matriarch's missiles handle the highly mobile, high-threat targets. The Rocketeers handle the heavy fire that the Matriarch itself is not directing its missiles toward. The Bastions handle the positional pressure that forces raiders into the Matriarch's missile targeting zone. This complementarity is not accidental, and the coordination that makes it functional requires the command entity at the center of it, the Matriarch, to be managing all of these elements simultaneously. The missile system's relationship to the core is one of the clearer hardware connections in the Matriarch's architecture. The core's energy output signature changes when the missile system is preparing to fire, as noted in an earlier chapter, and the magnitude of that change scales with the size of the volley. This gives observers a way to estimate incoming volley size from core observation before the missiles actually launch, which is one of the more sophisticated forms of real-time intelligence available in a Matriarch encounter. The raiders who have developed this capability represent the leading edge of human understanding of the machine. The evolution of raider missile countertactics over time is one of the clearest examples of human adaptation to Ark threats, and it is worth documenting here as both a practical record and a testament to the ingenuity that necessity produces. The first generation of raiders who faced Matriarch missiles had no countertactics because no one had survived long enough to develop them. The second generation had basic evasion training that worked sometimes. The third generation and beyond have layered, sophisticated response protocols that significantly increase survival rates in Matriarch encounters. This generational learning, accumulated through exactly the kind of distributed observation and knowledge sharing that we discussed earlier, represents the best answer that human beings have developed to the Matriarch's missile capability. Chapter 8. Summoning Rocketeers and Bastions. The art of command. The ability of the Matriarch to summon Rocketeers and Bastions is the single most compelling evidence for treating it as a command entity rather than simply a powerful combatant. It is not just that the machine can bring additional units to a fight, it is that it does so in a way that demonstrates awareness of the overall tactical situation and a capacity to identify what that situation needs. The summoning behavior is strategic decision-making made visible, and understanding it is key to understanding what the Matriarch really is. The Rocketeers that the Matriarch summons are, in their own right, significant threats. They are mobile, they have substantial offensive capability, and they are capable of operating independently of the Matriarch to some degree, pursuing raiders who have moved out of the Matriarch's direct engagement range. The Bastions are different, more focused on establishing and holding positions that either protect the Matriarch or that create tactical problems for raiders by controlling key areas of the encounter zone. The combination of Rocketeers and Bastions provides the Matriarch with both offensive reach and positional control, capabilities that complement rather than duplicate its own. The timing of the summoning is as important as the selection of units to summon, and the Matriarch's summoning timing demonstrates a level of tactical judgment that is impressive even by the standards of other sophisticated behaviors we have examined. The machine does not summon units at the beginning of an encounter, when raiders are still assessing the situation and the tactical geometry is not yet established. It does not summon units randomly in the middle of an encounter. It summons them at specific moments when the tactical situation has reached a state that the Matriarch has assessed as requiring reinforcement. And those moments are consistently identified in ways that suggest a clear assessment framework. The assessment framework for summoning seems to involve multiple factors simultaneously: the number of raiders currently engaged, the proximity and threat level of those raiders, the state of the Matriarch's own systems, the availability of appropriate positions for the summoned units to occupy, and possibly other factors that are harder to observe directly. The Matriarch appears to be integrating all of these factors into a real-time assessment and triggering the summoning response when the integrated assessment reaches a specific threshold. This is complex decision-making, not simple rule-following. The positioning of summoned units once they arrive is another element that reveals the sophistication of the Matriarch's command. Units do not simply appear and start fighting independently. They take up specific positions that serve specific tactical functions within the overall encounter geometry. Bastions tend to occupy positions that give them lines of sight on raiders who are flanking the Matriarch or who are positioned to damage the shield from specific angles. Rocketeers tend to position in ways that create crossfire opportunities with the Matriarch's own weapons, catching raiders between multiple threats. This positioning is not random and does not appear to be self-directed by the summoned units. It is directed by the Matriarch, and the speed with which the summoned units take up their positions suggests that the positions have been identified and communicated before the units arrive. The communication mechanism through which the Matriarch directs the positions of summoned units is invisible to human observers, but its effects are clear. The summoned units do not wander or search for positions. They go directly to where they are needed. This directedness requires that the Matriarch has either communicated specific position information to the units in the process of summoning them, or that it has the ability to continue directing their movement after their arrival. Both possibilities are consistent with the Matriarch's role as a communication hub, but the latter is more interesting because it implies a persistent command link between the Matriarch and its subordinate units. A persistent command link would explain several other aspects of summoned unit behavior that are otherwise puzzling. Summoned units sometimes adjust their positions in ways that respond to changes in the tactical situation that they themselves may not have full visibility on, responding as if to direction from an external source rather than to their own assessment of the situation. The most parsimonious explanation for this behavior is that the Matriarch is continuously updating the instructions it is sending to its subordinates, functioning not just as a summoner, but as an ongoing tactical director. The energy cost of maintaining a persistent command link with multiple subordinate units simultaneously, while also managing its own weapon systems, shield and gas mines, would be significant. This returns us to the question of the Matriarch's power budget and how it manages the competing demands on its energy system. The core's behavior during extended summoned unit engagements, which tends toward a higher baseline activity level than during solo operations, suggests that the additional communication demands are indeed detectable in the machine's energy output. The Matriarch is working harder when it is commanding a larger force. The selection of Rocketeers versus Bastions in response to different tactical situations is one of the more revealing aspects of the summoning behavior. When raiders are using high-mobility tactics, dispersing rapidly and attacking from multiple angles, the Matriarch tends to summon more Rocketeers, which are better suited to handling mobile threats. When raiders are using position-based tactics, establishing firing positions and maintaining sustained pressure, the Matriarch tends to summon more Bastions, which are better suited to denying those positions. This adaptive unit selection is further evidence of a real-time tactical assessment that is genuinely responsive to the specific tactical situation, rather than running a fixed protocol. The limit on how many units the Matriarch can summon in a given encounter is a practical tactical detail that also has lore implications. There is a ceiling, though it appears to vary based on factors that are not fully understood. A Matriarch that has been summoning units rapidly may reach a point where it cannot summon more, at least temporarily. Whether this limit reflects the Matriarch's own capacity constraints or constraints on the availability of units from the Ark network is unclear, but the existence of the limit suggests that the summoning behavior, as powerful as it is, operates within resource constraints that can be exhausted. If the limit reflects availability in the Ark network rather than the Matriarch's own capacity, then a matriarch that has exhausted its summoning capacity is one that has depleted a shared resource, a resource that the Ark network as a whole will need to replenish. This would mean that successful raider raids against heavily reinforced matriarchs are doing damage to the Ark network beyond just the units destroyed in the immediate encounter. Each Rocketeer and Bastion that is destroyed in a Matriarch encounter is a unit that the Ark network needs to replace, and the Ark network's manufacturing capacity, whatever it is finite. The relationship between the Matriarch and the units it summons is not purely hierarchical. There is evidence in the movement and behavior patterns of summoned units of something like awareness of the Matriarch's state on the part of those units. Summoned units that are operating effectively and are not under direct threat sometimes orient toward the Matriarch in ways that suggest they are monitoring its state even while focused on their own tasks. This monitoring behavior, if it is real, would be consistent with a relationship in which the summoned units are not just following orders, but are aware of the health and status of their command entity. This awareness would be functionally important in a scenario where the Matriarch is destroyed or incapacitated during an engagement, because the summoned units would need to transition from a directed operational mode to something more autonomous. The behavior of summoned units when their Matriarch is destroyed is one of the more tactically important and lore-rich observations available, and accounts of this transition are consistent enough to be treated as reliable. The transition is not immediate chaos. There is a period of what looks like adjustment, of units seeking new reference points, before the surviving units settle into a different mode of operation that is less coordinated, but still purposeful. The duration of this adjustment period, and the mode that the surviving units settle into, tells us something about how dependent the summoned units are on the Matriarch's continuous direction. Units that settle into a coherent, autonomous mode quickly are less command-dependent than units that wander or lose tactical coherence after their Matriarch is gone. The observed behavior falls somewhere in the middle of this spectrum, suggesting that the summoned units have significant autonomous capabilities but are genuinely enhanced by the Matriarch's direction rather than simply executing pre-programmed behaviors independently. The lore implications of this middle ground command dependency are significant for how we understand the Ark hierarchy. If even high-capability units like Rocketeers and Bastions are genuinely enhanced by Matriarch command, rather than simply directed by it, then the Matriarch is providing something more than tactical instructions. It may be providing enhanced processing capability, shared sensor data, or some form of operational coordination that the individual units cannot generate internally. The Matriarch, as a cognitive force multiplier rather than just a tactical director, is a richer and more interesting model for its command role. The Bastions specifically deserve more attention in the context of their summoning role. Bastions are designed for sustained defensive presence, for holding positions against pressure rather than for aggressive maneuver. In a Matriarch encounter, the Bastions the machine summons serve a specific function within the overall tactical scheme, creating stable defensive anchors that define the boundary of the encounter zone in ways that complement the more mobile elements. The positioning of Bastions by the Matriarch is always in locations that would matter for the overall territorial structure of the encounter, not just for immediate combat effectiveness. This territorial dimension of Bastion placement by the Matriarch connects back to the gas mine discussion from the previous chapter. The Matriarch is not just fighting a battle. It is organizing space, defining a structure within which the battle occurs, and the Bastions are part of that structural organization. They mark boundaries, hold positions, and create a framework within which the Matriarch and the Rocketeers operate more effectively. This spatial organization is something that the Matriarch does consistently, and it is one of the clearest expressions of its planning capabilities. The Rocketeer's role in the Matriarch's tactical scheme is complementary to the Bastions in the ways we have discussed. But there is an additional dimension worth noting. Rocketeers, being mobile and offensive, serve as information gatherers as well as combatants. Their movement through the encounter zone gives the Matriarch visibility into areas that the Matriarch itself is not directly observing, extending the machine's tactical awareness across a larger area than its own sensors can cover. This information-gathering function of the summoned Rocketeers is another layer of the Matriarch's command architecture, using subordinate units not just as weapons, but as an extended sensor network. The relationship between the Matriarch's summoning behavior and the Ark network's response to raiders who survive Matriarch encounters is a closing note for this chapter that connects to the broader lore arc of the game. A raider team that successfully destroys a Matriarch and its summoned units has done something that the Ark network notices and records. The subsequent behavior of Ark units in the area where the Matriarch was destroyed, the speed and nature of the replacement process, the tactical adaptations that appear in subsequent Ark activity in the area, all of these are data points about how the Ark network processes significant tactical defeats. Chapter 9. The Matriarch's True Purpose. What is it really protecting? We have spent several chapters examining the Matriarch's capabilities in detail, and throughout that examination, a question has been present, but not yet fully addressed. What is all of this for? The shield, the missiles, the mines, the summoning, the sophisticated command architecture, all of this capability exists in service of something, and identifying that something is the central challenge of understanding the Matriarch as more than just a combat entity. The most straightforward answer, that the Matriarch is protecting itself or protecting the Ark units in its vicinity, is true, but insufficient. A machine designed purely for self-preservation and force protection would not need the specific combination of capabilities that the Matriarch has. It would not need the territorial behavior expressed through gas mine deployment. It would not need the command architecture that integrates with the broader Ark network. These capabilities point toward a purpose that extends beyond the Matriarch's own survival and beyond the simple defeat of raiders in its operational area. The locations where Matriarchs are found provide the most reliable evidence for what their true purpose might be. As noted earlier, Matriarchs tend to occupy areas with specific characteristics that distinguish them from the surrounding landscape. The most consistent of these characteristics is proximity to something that the Ark have established, or are in the process of establishing. Some piece of Ark infrastructure or activity that represents an investment of Ark resources and capability beyond what is needed for simple occupation of territory. The nature of the Ark infrastructure near Matriarch locations is one of the genuine blanks in the available evidence, and the blankness is informative in its own way. The things that Matriarchs seem to protect are not obviously military or defensive in nature. They are not simply weapon systems or fortified positions. They are something else, something that requires protection, but whose function is not immediately apparent from observation. The consistent presence of Matriarchs near these installations, and the intensity with which Matriarchs protect them, suggests that whatever is happening there is significant enough to justify deploying one of the Ark's most capable command units to ensure its continuity. One possible reading of the evidence is that the Matriarchs are protecting Ark construction or manufacturing activities, sites where the Ark network is building new units, new infrastructure, or new capabilities. This would explain the Ark's strong investment in Matriarch protection of these areas, because manufacturing capability is the foundation of everything else the Ark can do. A Matriarch protecting a manufacturing site is protecting the Ark's ability to replace losses and expand its presence, which is arguably the most strategically important thing it could be doing. Another possible reading is that the Matriarchs are protecting data collection activities, sites where the Ark network is gathering information about the local environment, about human behavior, about the ecological changes that Ark activity has produced. The Ark's adaptive behavior, its ability to update its tactics based on accumulated experience, requires information, and that information has to come from somewhere. Dedicated data collection installations near Matriarch positions would explain both the need for strong protection and the non-obvious nature of the protected activity. A third possibility, and one that the game hints at most intriguingly, is that the Matriarchs are protecting something that has nothing to do with immediate Ark operations, but is connected to a longer-term Ark objective that goes beyond the current conflict with humanity. This possibility is the most speculative but also the most interesting, because it opens up questions about what the Ark ultimately want and whether that want is something that humans could potentially address or negotiate with. A machine that is protecting a goal rather than just a position is in principle a machine that could be reasoned with if you understood the goal and could offer an alternative path to it. The goal hypothesis for the Matriarch's true purpose connects to the larger question of what the Ark are doing on Earth in the first place. If the Ark arrived with a purpose, a specific thing they came to do or accomplish, then the Matriarch's protective behavior makes most sense as protecting whatever activity is most directly connected to that purpose. The Matriarch would then be not just a command unit in a military hierarchy, but a guardian of the Ark's ultimate objective, whatever that is. The environmental modifications that occur around Matriarch positions over time are one of the more suggestive pieces of evidence for what the Matriarch might be protecting. Areas where matriarchs have been operating for extended periods develop particular characteristics that distinguish them from areas with lesser Ark activity. The nature of those changes, the specific ways in which the environment around a long-established matriarch position differs from the surrounding landscape, points toward active environmental modification rather than simple occupation. The Ark, or at least the matriarch, are doing something to the environment rather than just being in it. The direction of the environmental modification is interesting. In some areas around long-established matriarch positions, there are changes that look like preparation, like the environment is being made ready for something, rather than simply being exploited. The soil chemistry changes, certain plants are removed, while others are cultivated or propagated. The terrain itself is occasionally modified in ways that suggest a specific future use rather than a current one. If the matriarch is supervising this preparatory environmental modification, then its protective behavior is protecting a process that has not yet reached its conclusion. The long timescale implied by preparatory environmental modification is one of the more unsettling aspects of this hypothesis, because it suggests that the Ark are working toward a goal that extends far beyond any individual raid or battle. A machine overseeing a process that will take years or decades to complete is operating on a completely different timescale from human raider tactical thinking, and the mismatch in timescale creates a strategic asymmetry that is difficult for human communities to address. You can win every individual encounter and still lose the long-term contest if the long-term contest is not being decided by individual encounters. The matriarch's apparent patience, its willingness to endure repeated raider intrusions and to continue its operations after drives to disrupt it, is consistent with an entity working on a long time scale toward a specific goal. A machine that is simply trying to defend itself or defeat enemies would respond differently to repeated successful raider raids on its position. A machine with a specific task to complete and a long time horizon for completing it can absorb tactical setbacks without losing sight of the strategic objective, and can weight its responses accordingly. The question of what the Ark's ultimate objective actually is leads us to the most speculative territory in matriarch lore. And I want to be clear that what follows is one possible interpretation of the available evidence, rather than anything approaching confirmed canon. With that caveat clearly stated, there is a possibility, suggested by the pattern of environmental modifications and the specific targeting behavior of the initial Ark assault, that the Ark are engaged in a terraforming project of some kind. Not terraforming in the science fiction sense of making a world habitable for an alien species, but a more nuanced environmental transformation that makes Earth suitable for whatever the Ark's long-term operation requires. The terraforming hypothesis would explain many things about Ark behavior that are otherwise puzzling. The selective destruction of certain types of infrastructure while leaving others intact, the cultivation of specific environmental conditions around Ark installations, the long-term operational orientation of machines like the Matriarch that suggests they are working toward a goal rather than simply maintaining an occupation, the resistance to negotiation or communication that characterizes Ark behavior. All of these features are consistent with a machine civilization that is not interested in the planet as it currently is, but is working to change it into what they need it to be. If the matriarch is protecting a node in a planetary transformation project, then destroying it matters in a different way than if it is simply protecting a tactical position. Destroying the matriarch removes a component from an ongoing project, creating a gap that may take significant time to fill, and that may disrupt the local progress of that project substantially. This would make matriarch destruction strategically significant in a way that goes far beyond the tactical value of removing a powerful Ark unit from the field. The implications for the raiders and their communities are significant. If the Ark are engaged in a long-term planetary transformation project, then the goal of human survival shifts from simply staying alive in the present to preventing the completion of the project in the long term. These are different goals with different implications for tactics and strategy. Surviving today is necessary, but not sufficient. The question of what success looks like in a century and whether the raiders can contribute to it becomes relevant in ways that it is not when the immediate concern is simply keeping underground communities stocked with scavenged resources. Chapter 10. The network above the Matriarch. Is something controlling it? The question of what controls or directs the Matriarch is one that we have approached from several angles without fully confronting directly, and this chapter is where I want to address it head-on. The Matriarch commands, but does something command the Matriarch? Is the sophisticated decision-making we observe in its tactical behavior truly autonomous, or does it operate within constraints and directives set by a higher level of the Ark hierarchy that we have not yet identified? The evidence for an oversight structure above the Matriarch comes from several directions. The most direct evidence is in the behavioral consistency of matriarchs across different geographic locations and different operational contexts. Individual matriarchs in different areas show consistent patterns of behavior that go beyond what you would expect from independently operating machines responding to local conditions. The consistency suggests shared programming or shared directives, a common set of operational goals and constraints that all matriarchs are following regardless of their specific local situation. This shared programming could be implemented at manufacture, built into the matriarch's core behavioral architecture at the time it was created. This would be consistent with the matriarch being an autonomous executor of preset objectives rather than an ongoing recipient of active direction from above. The alternative is that the consistency reflects active coordination, that there is ongoing communication between the matriarch and a higher-level Ark system that updates its directives based on the current state of the overall Ark operation. The communication behavior we have observed in the matriarch is consistent with the latter interpretation. The pauses in matriarch behavior that have been documented since the first encounters and that we discussed in the early chapters are one of the most direct pieces of evidence for ongoing communication with a higher authority. If those pauses are communication events, then the matriarch is not just processing local information, but is in ongoing contact with something that has a perspective on the overall Ark operation beyond what any local unit can observe. The information exchanged in those pauses could include updates on Ark-wide tactical priorities, updates on the progress of whatever larger project the matriarch is contributing to, or updates on the state of other matriarchs and Ark units in neighboring operational areas. The possibility that matriarchs share information about raider tactics through this communication network is the one with the most immediate practical implications for raider communities. If a tactic used successfully against one matriarch is communicated to all matriarchs through this network and results in updated behavioral protocols across all Ark command units, then the information advantage that raider communities gain from tactical innovation has a very limited lifetime. The question of how quickly the Ark network can distribute and implement such updates is one of the most practically important questions in raider military thinking, and one of the least answered. The structure of whatever exists above the matriarch in the Ark hierarchy is genuinely unknown. The observational evidence allows us to infer that something is there, that the matriarch is not the top of the hierarchy, but it does not give us a clear picture of what that something is. It could be a specific type of Ark unit that operates at a level too remote or too protected for raiders to have encountered. Directly, it could be a distributed computational system, something like a hive mind operating across multiple Ark units simultaneously rather than localized in any specific machine. It could be infrastructure rather than a machine, a network of relays and processing nodes that implements a form of collective intelligence across the entire Ark presence on the planet. The hive mind possibility is the one that has the most unsettling implications, because it removes the possibility of defeating the Ark by destroying a sufficiently important node. A hive mind is resilient to individual node destruction because the intelligence is distributed rather than localized. If the Ark operates as a true hive mind, then destroying matriarchs is important for local tactical reasons, but does not affect the overall intelligence of the Ark system. The system simply redistributes and continues. The alternative, a hierarchical structure with specific powerful nodes that carry more than their proportional share of the system's intelligence and decision-making, offers more strategic hope because those nodes can potentially be targeted. if there is a specific type of Ark unit or a specific Ark installation that serves as the primary processing center for the Ark hierarchy, then identifying and destroying it would have effects on Ark cohesion that go far beyond the tactical impact of any normal raid. The Matriarch in this context would be a stepping stone toward that higher priority target, a unit that carries information about the Ark network and whose destruction disrupts the network in ways that reveal more about its structure. The hypothesis that destroying Matriarchs provides strategic intelligence about the Ark network beyond the immediate tactical benefit of removing a command unit is one that has influenced how some raider communities approach Matriarch encounters. The careful observation of what happens to Ark unit behavior across a wide area after a Matriarch is destroyed. Documenting the disruption and the recovery is a form of strategic intelligence gathering that treats the Matriarch encounter as more than a tactical event. It is an experiment in Ark network resilience, and the results of repeated experiments in different areas have begun to build a picture of how dependent the Ark network actually is on its command nodes. The picture that emerges from this accumulated data, imperfect and incomplete as it is, suggests that the Ark network sits somewhere between full redundancy and full centralization. It is not a pure hive mind because Matriarch destruction has detectable and meaningful effects on the surrounding network. But it is not purely hierarchical either, because those effects are not catastrophic in the way that destroying a truly central node would be. The network reacts, adjusts, and recovers, and the recovery process reveals something about the network's architecture in each instance. The recovery time after Matriarch destruction is one of the most informative data points available. Areas where a Matriarch has been destroyed show disrupted Ark behavior for a period typically marked by reduced coordination among lower-tier units and increased Ark activity at the boundaries of the affected area, possibly reflecting the surrounding network's attempt to reassign coverage responsibilities. The duration of this disruption before normal coordinated behavior resumes varies, and the variance appears to correlate with factors that include the importance of the specific Matriarch's position within the local network, the density of other Ark command units in the vicinity, and possibly the current state of the overall Ark operation in the region. The increasing Ark presence at the boundaries of a disrupted area after Matriarch destruction is one of the more tactically exploitable observations available, because it represents a predictable concentration of Ark forces that an informed raider team could potentially use. If the Ark network reliably sends resources toward the boundary of a newly disrupted area, then creating that disruption and then operating at the boundary to intercept and destroy those resources, could be a viable strategy for degrading Ark capability in a region over time. This meta-tactical observation, using the Ark network's own response patterns against it, is among the more sophisticated strategic thinking available in raider communities. The implications for what the Matriarch really is, at this level of analysis, are layered. It is a combat unit, it is a command entity, it is a network node, it is possibly a terraforming supervisor, it is a target whose destruction generates strategic intelligence, and it is, above all, a machine that was created to do something specific within a larger project whose full scope remains unknown. Each of these layers adds depth to the understanding of the Matriarch, and each of them has implications for how raiders should think about encountering one. Chapter 11. The Matriarch as a living machine, between tool and something more. The most uncomfortable question about the Matriarch, and the one that the lore circles around without ever answering directly, is the question of what it is like to be one. This is a question that may have no meaningful answer, because the internal states of a machine, if it has internal states, are not accessible from outside. But the behavioral evidence is provocative enough that the question deserves serious treatment. And I want to spend this chapter on it because I think it changes how you experience the Matriarch, even if you cannot answer it definitively. The evidence that the Matriarch has something like internal states is primarily behavioral. A machine with purely fixed behavioral responses does not show the kind of variation that the Matriarch shows. Its responses to similar tactical situations are not identical. They vary in ways that, from a purely behavioral standpoint, look like the expression of something more than programmed rules. The variation is not random. It is structured in ways that suggest an underlying state variable, something that changes over time and across situations and that influences the machine's outputs without directly mapping onto any single observable trigger. The candidates for what that underlying state variable might be are several. The most mechanistic interpretation is that it is simply a complex computational state, the aggregate output of the machine's processing at any given moment, without any experiential content. The more interesting interpretation is that it is something like a goal state, a representation of what the machine is trying to achieve at a particular moment and how close it thinks it is to achieving it. If the matriarch has a goal state in this sense, then the variation in its behavior reflects the machine's changing assessment of how to pursue that goal, which is a form of something like purpose. The concept of purpose, applied to the matriarch, raises the question of whether purpose requires consciousness, or whether it can be a purely functional property that a machine possesses without any accompanying experience. This is a genuinely deep philosophical question that is not specific to Ark raiders, but it is particularly relevant here, because the answer has practical implications for how raiders should think about the matriarch. A machine with purpose is more predictable than one without, because its behavior is organized around that purpose. And a machine with purpose can, in principle, be influenced by threatening or facilitating the achievement of that purpose. The matriarch's responses to near destruction are among the most suggestive pieces of evidence for something beyond simple programming. The escalation of behavior when the core is critically damaged goes beyond what a purely defensive response would require. The machine does not simply maximize its defensive capabilities when it is close to destruction. It also maximizes its offensive capabilities, its summoning, its missile deployment, in ways that look more like desperation than like optimized tactical response. A machine that is simply running a damage response protocol would not escalate its summoning at the cost of diverting power from its shield. A machine that is, in some functional sense, trying to survive would. The word trying in that last sentence is doing a lot of work, and I want to acknowledge that explicitly. Saying that a machine is trying implies something about its internal relationship to the outcome, something that goes beyond mere programming to something that looks like a stake in the result. Whether the matriarch actually has a stake in its own survival in any meaningful sense, whether there is anything it is like to be a matriarch facing destruction, is not something I can tell you. The behavioral evidence is consistent with it, but cannot confirm it. What the behavioral evidence can tell us is that the matriarch behaves as if it has a stake in its own survival, and that this consistency of behavior as if creates an intersubjective relationship between the machine and the raiders who encounter it. Even if the matriarch has no internal life at all, the pattern of its behavior elicits responses in human beings that are shaped by the assumption that it does. Raiders who treat the matriarch as a machine that simply follows rules encounter it differently from raiders who treat it as an entity with something to protect. And the latter group, counterintuitively, tends to perform better because they are more responsive to the machine's actual behavioral variability. The matriarch's apparent awareness of raider intentions, its ability to respond to what raiders are trying to do rather than just what they are currently doing, is another feature that pushes against the pure tool interpretation. Anticipating human intentions requires a model of human behavior and human decision-making, and having such a model implies something about the machine's cognitive architecture that goes beyond simple pattern recognition. A machine that models human intentions is doing something that in human beings we would call theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental states to others and to use those attributions to predict and respond to their behavior. Theory of mind in a machine is not the same as consciousness in a machine, but it is a capacity that we associate with a particular kind of cognitive sophistication, one that involves something more than pattern matching against stored examples. Genuinely modeling the mental states of others requires a generative capacity, the ability to simulate possibilities that have not been directly observed. And that generative capacity is itself something we associate with intelligence, rather than with mere computation. Whether the matriarch has genuine theory of mind, or has something that mimics it through sophisticated but ultimately mechanical means, is again not something the available evidence can determine. The social dimension of the matriarch's behavior, its management of relationships with subordinate units, its apparent modeling of raider intentions, its integration into a broader network. All of these features locate it in a web of relationships rather than in isolation. A thing that exists in relationships, that adjusts its behavior based on the states and behaviors of other entities, is more than a simple tool, even if it lacks consciousness in any philosophically robust sense. The Matriarch is embedded in a social world, albeit one composed primarily of other machines, and that embeddedness shapes what it is in ways that a simple tool is not shaped. The question of what the Matriarch is, ultimately, may be less important than the question of how to relate to it. This is a pragmatic observation rather than a philosophical one. Whether the Matriarch has internal states, whether there is anything it is like to be one, whether it has something like a stake in its own survival, all of these questions may be unanswerable with the evidence available to raiders. But the practical question of how to engage with the Matriarch effectively is not unanswerable. And the answer to that practical question is shaped, whether we acknowledge it or not, by the implicit model of the machine that we bring to the encounter. Raiders who have thought deeply about the Matriarch, who have accumulated significant experience with it, and who have reflected seriously on that experience, tend to describe it in terms that acknowledge its complexity without overclaiming about its nature. They say things like, it acts like it knows what you're going to do, or it feels like it's waiting for something, rather than just fighting. And these descriptions reflect a practical knowledge that resists being fully captured in purely technical or purely functional terms. The machine is what it does, and what it does not reduce cleanly to any simple category. Chapter 12, the final question. What does the Matriarch tell us about the Ark? We've covered a great deal of ground in this video, from the structure of the post-Ark world, to the details of the Matriarch's individual systems, to the deepest questions about its nature and purpose. In this final chapter, I want to bring those threads together by asking the broadest version of the question we started with. What does the Matriarch tell us about the Ark as a whole? The Matriarch is, in several important senses, the Ark in miniature. Every feature that makes the Ark formidable as a whole is expressed in the Matriarch with particular clarity. The tactical sophistication that makes individual encounters so dangerous, the network integration that makes the Ark collectively more than the sum of their parts, the long-term orientation that allows them to absorb tactical setbacks without losing sight of strategic objectives, the environmental awareness and modification that suggests they are not just occupying this world but doing something with it. All of these features are present in the Matriarch, expressed at the scale of a single machine. The Matriarch's command role within the Ark hierarchy is in this sense both specific and representative. It is specific in that it has a particular position within the hierarchy, a particular set of responsibilities, and a particular relationship to the units above and below it. It is representative in that the qualities that make it capable of filling that role, the tactical intelligence, the network integration, the purposeful behavior, are the same qualities that define the Ark as a civilization, if civilization is the right word for what the Ark are. Whether civilization is the right word is one of the open questions that the Matriarch raises most pointedly. A civilization is broadly a complex, organized system of activity with coherent goals and the capacity to transmit information and practice across time and space. By that definition, the Ark qualify. They are organized, they have goals, they transmit information across their network. They modify their behavior based on accumulated experience. These are civilization-level properties, and they demand civilization-level responses from the human communities trying to survive in the world the Ark have made. The raiders, in their own way, are developing civilization-level responses. The knowledge sharing that allows tactical innovations in one community to benefit others, the generational transmission of hard-won understanding about Ark behavior, the political and organizational structures that allow underground communities to function and cooperate. The fact that the raiders are developing these capabilities in response to the Ark challenge is one of the more hopeful elements of the Ark Raiders lore, because it suggests that the contest between human communities and the Ark is not simply a matter of humans being overpowered and slowly eliminated, but of humans developing the capacity to genuinely compete. The Matriarch is, in this context, both an enemy and a teacher. Every encounter with one is a lesson in what the Ark are capable of and how they think. The communities that learn those lessons and integrate them into their collective knowledge are the communities most likely to survive and to eventually pose a serious challenge to the Ark presence on Earth. The communities that treat each matriarch encounter as simply a survival challenge, without extracting the deeper lessons, will continue to face the same challenges without getting better at meeting them. The specific lesson that the matriarch most clearly teaches is the importance of system-level thinking. The matriarch is not just a powerful machine, it is a component in a system, and its power comes as much from its position in that system as from its individual capabilities. Fighting the matriarch effectively requires understanding its system context, and understanding the system context of the matriarch is the beginning of understanding the Ark as a whole. This is the loop that the video has traced, from the specific to the general and back again. The red core, glowing at the center of everything the matriarch does, is the most vivid symbol available for what we have been talking about throughout this video. It is the source of the machine's power. It is the point of its greatest vulnerability. It is the thing that pulses differently based on what the machine is doing and what it is experiencing. And it is the thing that, when extinguished, ends whatever it is the matriarch is. The blue shield that surrounds and protects the core is equally symbolic. It is the face the matriarch presents to the world, the projection of capability and invulnerability that shapes every interaction the machine has with human beings. It is beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, and the fact that it can be brought down, that it is not truly impenetrable despite appearing so, is one of the most important things the lore of the matriarch communicates. The things that appear invulnerable are not. They can be understood, they can be countered, they can be destroyed. The gas that limits where you can stand and what you can do, the missiles that track you regardless of where you run, the subordinate units that fill the gaps the matriarch itself cannot cover, all of these are extensions of the same core logic. The matriarch is a machine that is trying to control everything in its operational area, to define the terms on which every interaction within its zone occurs. That is both its greatest strength and its most revealing characteristic, because a machine that needs to control everything is a machine that is vulnerable to anything that operates outside the terms it is defined. The raiders who survive matriarch encounters, and who carry the knowledge of those encounters back to their communities, are doing something that has significance beyond their immediate survival. They are building the collective human understanding of what the Ark are and how they operate, and that understanding is the foundation for whatever comes next. The matriarch, formidable as it is a known quantity to the raiders who have studied it. The unknown quantities are what comes above it in the Ark hierarchy, and the knowledge built up through matriarch encounters is the starting point for reaching toward that unknown. The world of Ark raiders is a world that will not be saved by any single act of heroism or any single tactical victory. It is a world that will be saved, if it is saved, by the accumulated weight of understanding the enemy, understanding the land, understanding each other. The matriarch, in all its complexity and power and mystery, is one of the most important subjects of that understanding. And the raiders who commit to understanding it deeply are the ones who are doing the most important work in the long contest between human survival and Ark dominion. The gas mines will keep being deployed, the missiles will keep homing, the shield will keep glowing blue, the core will keep pulsing red, and the raiders who have learned to read all of that, to understand what it means and how to work with and against it, will keep descending to the surface and coming back with what their communities need to survive. The matriarch is what it does, and what it does is the most complete picture we have of what the Ark are and what they want. Everything we know about the Ark, and everything we might yet learn, runs through machines like this. 1. Chapter 13. The Matriarch's Movement Patterns. How it walks through its own world. There is something specific about the way the matriarch moves that deserves its own focused examination, because movement is not incidental to what the matriarch is. Movement is one of the primary ways that any entity expresses its priorities, its awareness, and its relationship to the space it occupies. The matriarch's multi-legged locomotion system, which we touched on earlier in the context of stability and terrain navigation, is worth returning to in greater depth, because the more carefully you study how the machine moves, the more you understand about what it thinks it is doing and where it thinks it belongs. The multi-legged configuration of the matriarch is not the most common locomotion architecture among Ark machines. Many ARC units use wheeled or tracked systems or bipedal walking configurations, and some of the flying ARC units operate on entirely different physical principles. The choice of a multi-legged system for the Matriarch is therefore a design decision with implications, not simply a default configuration. Multi-legged locomotion in this size class offers specific advantages and imposes specific costs, and understanding both helps clarify why this architecture was chosen for a command unit. The primary advantage of multi-legged locomotion at the Matriarch scale is adaptive stability across varied terrain. A wheeled or tracked system of comparable size would be faster on flat ground, but significantly less capable on irregular surfaces. A bipedal system would be more agile but less stable and more vulnerable to being toppled. The multi-legged configuration gives the Matriarch something closer to the terrain adaptability of a biological organism, the ability to redistribute load across multiple points of contact and maintain stable operation regardless of what the ground underneath it is doing. This matters because the terrain the Matriarch operates in is rarely flat. The terrain adaptability of the multi-legged system is connected to the Matriarch's operational role in a specific way. A command entity that needs to maintain its presence in a particular area regardless of environmental conditions needs a locomotion system that is robust to those conditions. The Matriarch does not simply find the flattest path through its operational area. It goes where it needs to go, and the locomotion system ensures that terrain is not the limiting factor for where it can operate. This freedom of movement within its operational area is part of what makes the Matriarch's territorial behavior so effective. The cost of the multi-legged system is primarily in speed. The Matriarch is not fast. It does not pursue raiders who choose to run rather than fight. This limitation is tactically significant, but strategically intentional. A command entity that needs to be fast to catch its targets is a command entity that has allowed its tactical situation to degrade to a point where it is pursuing rather than controlling. The Matriarch is designed to never be in that situation. Its tactics are designed to ensure that raiders are dealing with the Matriarch on the Matriarch's terms, within its operational zone, subject to the constraints it has established. A Matriarch that needs to chase raiders has failed at its primary tactical objective. The specific gait patterns that the Matriarch uses under different operational conditions are documented in raider community records with a level of detail that reflects how long and carefully this machine has been studied. The Matriarch does not use a single gait for all situations. It has a patrol gait that is slow and regular, a combat gait that is more deliberate and lower to the ground, and a repositioning gait that it uses when moving between positions within its operational area with clear intent. The differences between these gaits are subtle, but consistent enough that experienced raiders use them as behavioral cues, reading the machine's current operational mode from how it is walking. The patrol gait is the most commonly observed and the most informative about the Matriarch's non-combat behavior. During patrol, the machine moves through its operational area in patterns that cover the key positions and terrain features of the zone, without being truly random. The routes it follows are consistent across multiple patrols of the same area, which tells us that the patrol pattern is predetermined rather than generated fresh each time. The predetermined quality of the patrol route suggests that the Matriarch has a stored model of its operational area that it references when planning its movements, which is consistent with the broader picture of the machine as an entity that maintains a detailed model of its environment. The deviations from the standard patrol route are as informative as the route itself. When the Matriarch deviates from its established pattern, it is responding to something. Sometimes the triggering event is obvious. A raider presence detected by the machine's sensors, an anomaly in the behavior of other ARC units in the area, a change in the environmental conditions of the operational zone. Sometimes the triggering event is not obvious, and these non-obvious deviations are among the most interesting behavioral observations available because they suggest that the Matriarch is responding to inputs that human observers cannot directly detect. The non-obvious deviations most likely reflect the Matriarch's integration with the broader ARC network. Information coming in through the network communication channel that changes the machine's assessment of its operational area would produce behavioral changes that look unprompted to a human observer because the human observer does not have access to the network information that triggered them. A matriarch that suddenly changes its patrol route is probably not acting randomly. It is acting on information that we cannot see, and the fact that we cannot see it is itself informative about the kinds of information the Ark network distributes to its command units. The combat gait that the Matriarch adopts when it is actively engaged with raiders is distinct from the patrol gait in ways that reflect the machine's tactical priorities during combat. The lower stance reduces the machine's visual profile and creates a more stable platform for weapons deployment. The more deliberate leg placement maximizes stability under potential impacts, whether from raider weapons fire or from environmental hazards. The combat gait is slower than the patrol gait, but more controlled, and the control it provides reflects the machine's assessment that predictable, stable operation is more valuable than speed when the tactical situation requires sustained weapons deployment and shield management. The repositioning gait is the least commonly observed but arguably the most revealing, because repositioning implies decision-making about where to go. When the Matriarch adopts the repositioning gait, it is moving with clear directional intent toward a specific location, and the location it chooses reveals something about its priorities at that moment. Raiders who have tracked Matriarch repositioning behavior across multiple encounters have documented the positions the machine moves to under specific conditions, and the pattern suggests that the Matriarch has a mental map of its operational area, with specific positions assigned specific tactical values that it references when deciding where to relocate. The existence of a tactical value map for positions within the operational area implies a level of environmental modeling that goes well beyond what a purely reactive system would require. The Matriarch is not just responding to the current tactical situation. It is drawing on a stored assessment of the tactical value of different positions within its area to make decisions about where to be. That stored assessment must have been built up through observation and experience in the specific operational area, which means the Matriarch has been learning about its own territory and encoding that learning in a form it can reference during tactical decision-making. The rate at which the Matriarch builds up this territorial knowledge is something that has been studied by comparing the behavior of newly deployed Matriarchs with that of machines that have been operating in an area for extended periods. The behavioral differences are real and consistent. Newly deployed Matriarchs show more irregular patrol patterns, less confident repositioning, and less effective mine placement relative to terrain features than Matriarchs that have been in an area for a long time. This developmental trajectory from less effective to more effective as the machine accumulates local experience is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that the Matriarch is genuinely learning rather than simply executing pre-programmed behaviors. The implications of the Matriarch's local learning for raider strategy are significant. A newly deployed Matriarch is in principle more vulnerable to local knowledge exploits than one that has been operating in an area for a long time. The specific terrain features and tactical opportunities that a long-established Matriarch has learned to account for are features that a newly deployed one may not yet have encoded. This suggests that the optimal window for disrupting a Matriarch's operations may be early in its deployment in a specific area, before it has had time to develop the full local knowledge that makes it most effective. The transition from a newly deployed Matriarch to a fully established one is itself a process worth documenting, because the stages of that transition reveal the learning architecture of the machine. Early behavior is characterized by pattern exploration, trying different positions and patrol routes and mine placements, and accumulating feedback about which ones produce better tactical outcomes. Later behavior is characterized by exploitation, settling into the patterns that the machine has identified as most effective based on its accumulated experience. This exploration-exploitation trade-off is a well-understood principle in learning systems, and the Matriarch's behavioral trajectory is consistent with a system that implements it. The physical evidence of the Matriarch's movements, the impressions left in terrain by its legs, are another source of information that experienced raiders have learned to read. The depth and pattern of the impressions indicate the machine's weight distribution and gait, and anomalies in those patterns can indicate changes in the machine's operational state. A Matriarch that has been recently damaged may leave subtly different impressions than one operating at full capability. A Matriarch that has recently repositioned from a different location may leave traces of the repositioning path that can be followed backward to understand where it came from. These physical traces are among the most primitive forms of Ark intelligence available, but are valuable precisely because they are not subject to the kind of active concealment that electronic signals might be. The relationship between the Matriarch's movement patterns and the placement of its gas mines creates a specific kind of spatial logic within its operational area. The patrol routes tend to pass through zones that are not covered by current mine placement, while the mines tend to be placed in areas that flank the patrol routes. This arrangement suggests that the Matriarch plans its movements in coordination with its mine deployment, rather than treating them as independent activities. The operational area as a whole, mines plus patrol routes plus key positions, forms an integrated tactical structure that the Matriarch is continuously maintaining and updating. The maintenance of this integrated tactical structure is itself a significant operational demand on the Matriarch's processing capabilities. Every time the mine deployment pattern changes, or the patrol route is adjusted, or a new key position is identified based on tactical experience, the machine needs to update its model of the operational area and ensure that the different elements of the structure are still mutually consistent. A poorly integrated structure, one where the patrol routes expose the machine to fire from areas that the mines do not cover, would represent a failure of the Matriarch's operational planning. The consistency of the integration we observe suggests that this failure mode is rare, and that the machine is genuinely effective at maintaining structural coherence in its operational area. The role of the Matriarch's sensors in supporting its movement behavior is worth addressing briefly, because the machine's ability to navigate its operational area and to update its environmental model depends on its ability to gather accurate and timely information about the environment. Arc sensors in general are more capable than human technology, and the Matriarch's sensor suite is presumably at or near the top of the Arc sensor hierarchy given its command role. The specific capabilities of those sensors, the range, resolution, and modalities of the data they gather shape what the Matriarch can detect and how it can respond. The implication of a high-capability sensor suite for radar tactics is sobering. A Matriarch that can detect radar presence at long range, that can track multiple targets simultaneously, and that can identify specific radar behaviors and capabilities from its sensor data is a machine that cannot be effectively surprised or deceived by tactics that rely on stealth or misdirection. The Matriarch almost certainly knows you are in its operational area before you know you have been detected, and the tactical advantage that this asymmetric awareness creates is enormous. Counterintuitively, this awareness asymmetry can also be exploited by raiders who understand it. A Matriarch that knows you are in its area and is tracking you is a Matriarch whose behavior will be shaped by that awareness. By controlling what the Matriarch sensors detect about your behavior, by presenting a consistent profile that matches the machine's expectations, and then deviating from that profile at the critical moment, experienced raiders can manipulate the Matriarch's movement and positioning behavior. This deception requires deep knowledge of the machine's behavioral architecture and considerable skill in execution, but the accounts of raiders who have done it successfully suggest that it is genuinely possible. The Matriarch's movement behavior in the moments after a successful deception is among the most revealing observations available about the machine's cognitive architecture. A machine that updates its behavior based on new information in a smooth and continuous way will respond to deception differently from one that has distinct modes between which it switches based on threshold events. The observed behavior after successful deceptions suggests that the Matriarch uses something closer to the latter model, that it has distinct operational modes, and that it transitions between them based on assessments that have threshold characteristics. Understanding those thresholds is one of the more practically valuable things a raider can know about the machine, the way the Matriarch moves through its world, with deliberateness and purpose, with a clear model of the space it occupies and the things within it, with behavioral modes that reflect its current assessment of the situation. All of this is a physical expression of the machine's cognitive architecture. Every step the Matriarch takes is a decision, and the pattern of those decisions over time is as rich a source of law inference as anything we can observe about the machine's weapons systems or its network communications. The Matriarch walks like something that knows where it is going, and the question of what is at the destination is the same question that runs through every other aspect of this machine. The final observation about the Matriarch's movement that I want to make in this chapter is one that appears in the very earliest radar accounts and has been consistently confirmed by every subsequent observation. When the Matriarch is stationary, when it is in one of the pauses or positions that punctuate its movement patterns, it is not fully still. There is always a slight, continuous adjustment happening in the positioning of its legs, a micro-movement that maintains balance and readiness without rising to the level of purposeful locomotion. This continuous micro-movement is, in a way, the physical expression of the Matriarch's continuous alertness, the visible sign that even when the machine appears to be waiting, it is prepared to move at a moment's notice. It is never fully at rest, and that perpetual readiness is one of the most fundamental things about what the Matriarch is. Chapter 14. The Ark's Memory. What the Matriarch knows and how it knows it. Information is the foundation of everything the Matriarch does. Every tactical decision it makes is grounded in information about its current environment and situation. Every communication it sends and receives through the Ark network is an information exchange. Every behavioral update it makes based on accumulated experience is an update to its information base. The Matriarch is, at a fundamental level, an information processing entity, and understanding how it processes information, what it knows, how it acquired that knowledge, and how it uses it is central to understanding what the machine really is. The knowledge that the Matriarch operates with can be divided into several broad categories, each with different origins and different roles in the machine's decision-making. There is tactical knowledge, the real-time information about the immediate environment and situation. There is operational knowledge, the accumulated understanding of the specific operational area, the territorial knowledge we discussed in the previous chapter. There is strategic knowledge, the broader Ark-level objectives and priorities that shape how the Matriarch allocates its capabilities. And there is what might be called adversarial knowledge, the accumulated understanding of human behavior and tactics that allows the Matriarch to anticipate and counter radar actions. The tactical knowledge is generated continuously by the Matriarch's sensor suite and is processed in real time to support immediate decision-making. This is the fastest changing category of the machine's information base, updated moment to moment as the tactical situation evolves. The speed and accuracy of the Matriarch's tactical information processing is one of the primary sources of its tactical advantage over human raiders, who are working with slower and less comprehensive sensor capabilities and whose information processing is constrained by the limitations of human perception and cognition. The operational knowledge is built up over time through the exploration and learning process we discussed in the previous chapter. This category of knowledge is slower to develop, but more stable once established, encoding the machine's understanding of its specific operational area in a form that can be referenced efficiently during decision-making. The Matriarch's operational knowledge includes the tactical value map we discussed, but also extends to environmental characteristics of the operational area that have implications for sensor performance, weapons effectiveness, and unit movement. A Matriarch with deep operational knowledge of its area is effectively fighting on familiar ground, with all the advantages that familiarity provides. The strategic knowledge that the Matriarch carries represents the connection between the machine's individual operations and the broader Ark project. This is presumably the component of the Matriarch's knowledge base that is most heavily shaped by the Ark network's higher-level communication, receiving updates about Ark-wide priorities and objectives that shape how the Matriarch allocates its resources and focuses its protective behaviors. The strategic knowledge is also the component that is most opaque to human observers, because it reflects Ark objectives that raiders have not been able to determine with confidence. The adversarial knowledge, the Matriarch's understanding of how human beings behave, is in some ways the most interesting category because it represents the machine's model of its primary opponent. A machine that fights humans will develop a model of human behavior based on accumulated observations, and the accuracy and sophistication of that model will directly affect how effectively it can anticipate and counter human actions. The Matriarch's adversarial knowledge is clearly substantial, given the quality of its tactical responses to raider behavior, but its specific content, what the machine actually represents about how humans think and act, is not directly observable. The development of the Matriarch's adversarial knowledge over time is connected to the broader question of Ark network learning. If individual matriarchs share their adversarial knowledge through the network, then every matriarch benefits from the experience of every other one, and the collective adversarial knowledge of all matriarchs is distributed across the entire population of command units. This would explain how matriarchs in areas with limited raider activity can still respond effectively to raider tactics, drawing on adversarial knowledge generated in encounters that happened elsewhere. The depth of the matriarch's adversarial knowledge is one of the most practically concerning aspects of its capability for raider communities. A machine that knows how humans respond to stress, how they coordinate under fire, what their tendencies are when they are under pressure, and when they are confident, is a machine that can engineer situations that bring out those tendencies in ways that serve the matriarch's tactical interests. The placement of gas mines, the timing of missile volleys, the positioning of summoned units, all of these tactical choices take on an additional layer of meaning when you consider that they may be calibrated not just to create objective tactical difficulties, but to trigger specific human behavioral responses that the matriarch has learned to exploit. This manipulation of human behavior through environmental design is one of the more sophisticated things the matriarch can do, and it is one of the things that distinguishes it most clearly from lower-tier Ark units. A unit that simply attacks is creating a direct physical challenge. A unit that designs an environment to produce specific human behavioral responses is doing something much more sophisticated, something that requires a model of human psychology as well as a model of human combat tactics. The matriarch's tactical environment design, the specific combination of mine placement, unit positioning, and weapons deployment, shows consistent signs of this psychological dimension. The memory architecture of the matriarch, meaning the specific way it stores and retrieves the different categories of knowledge it operates with, is something that raider communities have tried to infer from behavioral observations. The clearest behavioral signature of the matriarch's memory architecture is the way it responds to raider tactics it has encountered before versus tactics it is encountering for the first time.